Chapter 22-23. At this moment, be it the itinerant cultivators who were hopeful or in despair, they had already cast aside all the distracting thoughts in their hearts and wholeheartedly sensed the pitch-black liquid stirred up by the huge spike from Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron. They sensed the aura that they had been looking forward to and even dreaming of. It was the aura that belonged to the creation energy. It really is the creation energy. It really is the creation energy. This was what appeared after they sensed it clearly. Such thoughts echoed in their minds one after another. With this thought in mind, their breathing became heavier, and even their expressions changed correspondingly. It was a change that represented excitement. At this moment, Luo Fan narrowed his eyes and shouted, "Open!" With this shout, the spike that rushed out from the three-legged cauldron seemed to have penetrated through something and suddenly felt lighter. At the same time, the sound of something being torn apart rang out from the bottom of the spike. With this soft sound, the deep pool opened with a loud bang. The void began to churn crazily. Countless fine cracks appeared on the surface of the deep pool and began to spread in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already swept across the surface of the deep pool, making it seem like the surface of the deep pool had turned into a broken mirror. Soon after, the cracks expanded at an unimaginable speed. In the end, all the fine fragments completely collapsed. Under a violent and unparalleled impact, they directly rose up, converging into a great river that rushed straight up. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was standing on the spot, was directly drowned by the impact. His entire body seemed to have completely dissipated in the terrifying impact. Facing such a change, the many itinerant cultivators in the surroundings all had complicated expressions. They believed that if they were to withstand such an impact, they would definitely not be able to survive. Under such circumstances, they naturally did not think that Luo Fan would be able to survive such an impact. Even if the strength that he displayed seemed to be many times stronger than theirs, it was still the same. After thinking that it was impossible for Luo Fan to survive, one could imagine what they were thinking in their hearts. They thought that Luo Fan had sacrificed himself to bring them enough opportunities so that they would no longer need to fight for a bit of the power of creation like before. With this understanding, it was easy to imagine how complicated their feelings were. The changes in the pool didn't stop because of their complicated feelings. At this moment, the waves that rushed out of the pool like a river constantly increased, and the impact became stronger and stronger. At first, it was only inside the deep pool. But as time passed, the deep pool itself began to gradually collapse. The waves began to exceed the limits of the deep pool and began to expand outwards. Because of this, how could the rogue cultivators around the pond dare to stay any longer? One by one, they began to retreat excitedly. In a flash, they had already retreated tens of thousands of light years away. As for the cave abodes, dojos, and worlds that they had left behind, they could no longer be bothered with them. At this moment, the reason why they were still so excited despite appearing to be severely damaged was actually the feeling of a person's table being crushed by gold bars that were constantly emerging. If the table was crushed by the gold bars, how many gold bars would that mean? And how much would the gold bars be worth? For ordinary people who wanted to buy gold based on grams, the significance behind this was self-evident. It was just the loss of a table. How could it suppress the excitement in their hearts because of the appearance of the gold bars? Obviously, to these rogue cultivators, the dojos and cave abodes were actually not much different from the tables of ordinary people. In fact, they might even be far inferior. After all, ordinary people could not casually create a table, and they would need to buy it with money. For these rogue cultivators, a cave abode or a dojo could naturally be created with a single thought and a surge of power. With that being the case, how could they possibly diminish their excitement over the endless power of creation that was surging out of the deep pool? At this moment, a strange light gradually emerged from the wave. Immediately after, the light began to sweep in all directions at an unimaginable speed. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived at the surface of the wave. It had arrived in all directions and completely enveloped every inch of the void and every surface of the wave. After arriving here, the light began to twist and wriggle. In the blink of an eye, it formed countless runes that linked together to form an incomparably huge and terrifyingly powerful formation. It forcibly restrained the wave of creation energy that was constantly expanding and spreading in all directions. As the formation was formed, although the wave of creation energy continued to surge upwards, it no longer expanded in all directions. It looked as if it had already turned into a vertical river. Of course, it was a joke to say that it was vertical in the void. This was because there was no up, down, left, or right in the void. There was no direction. At this moment, it looked like a vertical river. However, from another perspective, it was actually a river. What's going on? Many of the itinerant cultivators were shocked. The impact of the creation energy was so terrifying that even the surrounding void could not withstand it. However, there was actually an unknown force that easily restrained the wave's power and turned it into a long river. This kind of mighty force simply subverted their worldview. Soon, the image of a person flashed across the minds of the itinerant cultivators. The image of a cultivator that they thought was already dead. The cultivator who had died in order to give them an opportunity. The image of Luo Fan. Based on their knowledge, no matter how they thought about it, only the expert who had broken through the restriction of the deep pool that had restricted them for countless years could do this. Is he a disciple of the Tao Master? At this time, the doubts that had been suppressed because of Luo Fan's death resurfaced in the hearts of many rogue cultivators. Obviously, they were no longer certain that Luo Fan was a disciple of the Tao Master. After all, if it was the Tao Master's disciple, would he do this for them? Would it break the restrictions set by the Tao Master's disciples? However, if he was a rogue cultivator, how could he possess such incredible power? Could it be a senior who has returned from a higher level? A rogue cultivator suddenly murmured. He did not transmit his voice to the rogue cultivators, but he did not restrict the transmission of his voice either. Therefore, even though the voice was faint and could not be heard by ordinary people who were a little far away, it was not difficult for them to hear. But at this moment, it was easily heard by the tens of billions of rogue cultivators here. That's right. He must be a senior who had returned from a higher level. Damn it, how could I forget about this possibility? The rogue cultivators felt as if they had been struck by lightning. Their expressions were filled with regret, fear, and excitement. The regret and fear were naturally because they had indiscriminately determined that the expert was a disciple of the Tao Master, and then triggered their strongest attack to attack him. Their regret and fear were naturally not because they felt guilty for blaming Luo Fan wrongly. The reason why they had such intense regret and lingering fear was because if Luo Fan wasn't strong enough, or if he wasn't magnanimous enough, then their attacks might have cut off the opportunity they were seeing right now. As a result, they could not obtain so much power of creation, and could only fight bloody battles for the slightest bit of power of creation like before. As for their excitement, it was needless to say. The appearance of Luo Fan had let them know that the seniors at a higher level had not forgotten about them. It let them know that they were not alone, and that they could still find an organization. The long river continued to extend and extend. Hundreds of light years, thousands of light years, tens of thousands of light years, hundreds of thousands of light years, millions of light years in just a few short breaths. The long river seemed to have directly cut open the entire rogue cultivator's territory, causing the entire void of the rogue cultivator's territory to be divided into two by the long river. It was divided into the left and right sides of the long river. What is this? Exclamations of surprise and joy came from all over the rogue cultivator's territory. This gathering point of the source of creation was just one of the many gathering points in the rogue cultivator's territory. In other locations, there were other origins of creation that were larger or smaller than this one, and there were also settlements over there. At this moment, the long river of power of creation pierced through the void and would naturally pass by the nearby settlements. Naturally, it would be discovered by the rogue cultivators in the settlement. To those itinerant cultivators who had to wait for tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of millions of years, just to obtain a trace of the creation energy, and had to stand out in battles against other itinerant cultivators to obtain the creation energy, this river of creation energy that spanned across the void was simply like a feast placed in front of a starving ghost. At this moment, a large number of rogue cultivators charged into the river against the terrifying impact produced by the river. They couldn't wait any longer and wanted to obtain the endless power of creation to aid their cultivation. As for those rogue cultivators, it was unknown if they had died from the impact or something had happened, but after they charged into the river, they disappeared without a trace, as if they had never appeared. This situation was clearly a warning to the other rogue cultivators, so they did not dare to rush into the river. However, they did not think too much about it. They did not think that there was anything wrong with the river, but only thought that it was a change brought about by the river's formation and spreading. Perhaps when the river stabilized and stopped flowing, the situation would change. With such thoughts in mind, their mood was not affected by the abnormality in the river. They were still excited and full of anticipation. The river continued to spread for a few days and nights. In the end, through some indescribable and mysterious change, the river connected to its source from another direction. In other words, it connected to the bottom of the pool, where the river had been born. The instant the two sides came into contact, the entire rogue cultivator territory shook violently. Buzzing sounds continuously spread from the two sides of the river in all directions, gradually engulfing the entire void. In an instant, the entire void seemed to be filled with endless sound waves. In the blink of an eye, the entire void seemed to have turned into an endless world of sound waves, a world of sound waves, and a space of sound waves. Or, to be more precise, it was a vast and incomparably huge world of sound waves composed entirely of sound waves. The crowd of rogue cultivators was dumbfounded by the change. They could not believe their eyes. These rogue cultivators were not ordinary people. They were experts who had passed the tests of the Tao Master's path and ascended from the first level to the fourth level. There was naturally no need to mention how knowledgeable such an expert was, and how strong his perception was. They immediately understood that the reason why the sound waves had such a change was partly because the source of the sound waves was extremely profound, but the more important reason was that the sound waves were mixed with a huge amount of creation power. Due to the tremendous amount of Genesis energy fusing with the sound waves, the information and power contained in the sound waves were instantly converted into the boundless heaven and earth, boundless worlds, and boundless space-time, which then turned into this cluster of worlds that filled the entire territory of the rogue cultivators. It really is the creation power. At this moment, the rogue cultivators who had already believed that the long river contained the creation power were both delighted and heartbroken. They were delighted because they had truly witnessed the characteristics of the power contained in the long river and knew that it was the creation power that they had been dreaming of. However, they were heartbroken because the sound waves had wasted the creation power. One must know that in that instant, the amount of creation energy that had fused into the sound wave was probably several times more than the sum of all the creation energy that had been obtained by itinerant cultivators in the territory of itinerant cultivators in the past billions of years. At this moment, such a huge amount of creation power had been directly wasted by the sound waves in front of their eyes. None of them had obtained it, and it had not brought any benefits to anyone's cultivation. How could the rogue cultivators, who had to use a trace of creation power as if it were 100 strands, not feel heartbroken? At this moment, the buzzing sound gradually subsided. The endless world of sound waves, and the endless world of sound waves, and the endless spacetime began to gradually collapse. The world of sound waves, and the world of sound waves, and the spacetime were generally no different from the world of sound waves, and the spacetime, but that was only on the surface. Without the support of concepts and willpower, it was impossible for the world of sound waves, and the world of sound waves, and the spacetime to exist for a long time. After the source of the world of sound waves, which was the long river, disappeared, the world of sound waves, and the world of sound waves, naturally began to lose their original structure. They gradually collapsed and dissipated. Of course, compared to the speed at which they were born, the speed at which they dissipated was billions of times slower. At this moment, although all the world of sound waves and the spacetime were continuously collapsing and dissipating, the rogue cultivator territory was still filled with the world of sound waves, and the world of sound waves, and the spacetime. It no longer seemed as empty as before. Instead, it seemed more crowded, as if even the rogue cultivators could not exist freely in the void. Endless creation power continuously dissipated from the collapsing world of sound waves, and the spacetime. The creation power was the product of the creation power that enveloped the entire world of sound waves being released after the world of sound waves gradually collapsed. However, since the world of sound waves had already been constructed once, the nature of the creation power had changed compared to the original pure creation power. Among them was an imprint that belonged to the world of sound wave. Such an imprint allowed them to be used to construct the world of sound waves, and the world of sound waves would yield twice the result with half the effort. However, it would take twice the effort to construct the world of sound waves as the foundation, and if the difference in the cultivation path was too great, it might not even be constructed at all. If it was in the domain of the Tao Master, the creation power would gradually recover its purity under the endless pure creation power, and the imprint in it would gradually disappear. However, in the territory of independent cultivators, where the power of creation was thin, the power of creation would clearly remain for a long time. In fact, it was even possible that there would still be the mark of the Soundwave world cluster within it after a very long time. Any cultivator who had stayed in the domain of the Tao Master would be disdainful of the creation power, and they would not even come into contact with the creation power. However, it was obvious that this was the rogue cultivator territory. Here, even a trace of the creation power was enough to set off a bloody battle. It was enough to kill thousands of rogue cultivators. Chapter 22-24. Although the power of creation that was branded with the Soundwave world cluster had been contaminated, it was not impossible for it to be purified with a large amount of energy and wisdom. After all, the essence of the power of creation was still there. The reason why it became useless in Luo Fan's eyes was because it was branded with something that shouldn't be there. Obviously, as long as it was a brand, it could be removed. It was the same for the brand on the power of creation. In other words, if those itinerant cultivators wanted to use the power of creation, they only needed to spend a little more effort to purify the brand. This was rather troublesome, but it was clearly not impossible. For Luo Fan, who had the power of creation at his fingertips, this kind of trouble was enough to make him abandon the power of creation. However, for the many rogue cultivators in the domain of rogue cultivators, let alone the brand of the Soundwave world cluster, even if there were another 10, 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 brands, they would not be able to deal with it. They were willing to spend endless energy and time to destroy the brand one by one and take the power of creation for themselves. This was clearly the sequela left behind by the extreme lack of the power of creation in the past. Under such a sequela, the many itinerant cultivators were like cats that had seen fish in the face of the strands of power of creation that were constantly escaping from the Soundwave world, and the Soundwave spacetime. They began to frantically plunder and seize all the power of creation that they could see and come into contact with. During this process, they would naturally encounter each other. Under the extreme desire for the power of creation, it was naturally inevitable for them to fight and kill each other. Fortunately, there was a huge river of Genesis energy in the sky, allowing all the rogue cultivators to see it. That was why the fights between them were restrained, although it was still terrifying and bloody. At least it wasn't like before, where they would fight to the death and perish together. This kind of fighting and killing decreased as the power of creation increased. The countless itinerant cultivators gradually understood that the situation in the domain of itinerant cultivators had changed. The incomparably scarce power of creation no longer seemed to be as scarce as they had thought. In just a few hours, they gradually gave up on the power of creation that was originally sought after by many rogue cultivators like a flock of bees. They began to flow wantonly in the void. More and more itinerant cultivators gradually shifted their gazes from the world of sound waves, and the power of creation that was released from the sound waves to the long river that cut through the void. After a period of development, the river had gradually stabilized. The formation that had appeared on the surface of the river to restrict it and prevent it from expanding endlessly had already disappeared without a trace. He didn't know if it was just hidden, or if it had been completely devoured by the river of creation power. Although it had only been a few hours, countless itinerant cultivators had already used all sorts of methods to probe the river, study it, and understand it. Of course, their research and understanding weren't as reckless as those itinerant cultivators who couldn't control their emotions and charged into the river. Instead, they used all sorts of strange methods, such as projections, clones, abilities, or even powers to probe the river to understand the dangers and opportunities that might exist in the river. Although most of their research and understanding had failed, the projections or clones that were sent into the river were quickly devoured by the river and disappeared without a trace. However, there were still some methods that yielded feedback, allowing the itinerant cultivators to gradually understand the characteristics of the river. The power of creation inside is so dense that it's simply more terrifying than any solid object. With my ability, I will be corroded and assimilated within a few breaths. This was the thought that appeared in the hearts of many itinerant cultivators. Through various methods, they had gained an understanding of the nature of the creation river, but they were pleasantly surprised, shocked, and helpless. They were pleasantly surprised and shocked because the power of creation in the river was so dense. If they could find a way to obtain it, it would be a great benefit to any of them. However, they were helpless because the power of creation seemed to be unreachable in the current situation. It was like the moon in the water, they could see but not touch. There must be a way. This was the thought in the hearts of the itinerant cultivators. This kind of mentality that never gave up and never felt despair was a quality that any cultivator who could reach this step must have. Even if the itinerant cultivators had different strengths and thoughts, their mentality was similar. Therefore, even at this time, even if they found that the power of creation was so troublesome and seemed to have fallen into an endless loop that they couldn't use, none of them had the thought of giving up. What about that senior? Suddenly, at a certain moment, an itinerant cultivator raised such a doubt. The senior that he was referring to was naturally Luo Fan, who they mistakenly thought had come down from the 5th level of the Tao Master Path, or even higher. He might have already sacrificed himself. Even a senior might not be able to resist the corrosion of such a dense power of creation. A itinerant cultivator sighed at this moment, his expression inexplicably sorrowful. Because of the long river of creation that Luo Fan had left for them, their impression of Luo Fan had already undergone a 180-degree change. The originally terrible situation had now become as good as it was now. Now, the sorrowful emotions of the itinerant cultivators were completely from the bottom of their hearts, and there was no trace of them acting. At this moment, although most of the itinerant cultivators were paying attention to the long river of creation and were looking for ways to make use of the countless power of creation in the long river of creation, there were still a large number of itinerant cultivators who were wary of others. Naturally, they were listening to the voices of other cultivators at all times. Therefore, at this moment, although the judgment made by the itinerant cultivator was not transmitted to the entire area of itinerant cultivators, it was directly transmitted out. Therefore, at this moment, although the judgment made by the itinerant cultivator was not transmitted to the entire area of itinerant cultivators, it was directly transmitted out, and a large number of itinerant cultivators heard his judgment, causing their expressions to become solemn and sorrowful. Perhaps not. It's a mistake to use our current strength to speculate about the seniors' strength. What we can't do doesn't mean that the seniors at the top can't do it. Not to mention other things, do you think we have the strength to create such a long river of creation? An itinerant cultivator was very displeased. This was not his own judgment, but a refutation of the previous person's judgment. Naturally, it was not in a normal voice, but directly transmitted out, so that almost all the itinerant cultivators could hear this rebuttal that came out of nowhere. Although the itinerant cultivators in this area were originally immersed in the long river of creation, they were still very perceptive. Although the rebuttal came out of nowhere, they already understood the cause and effect after a slight deduction, and their expressions all changed. Some became anxious, some became sad, some became joyful, and some even became excited. All sorts of emotions represented their different thoughts and judgments. Just as the itinerant cultivators were secretly trying to figure out the various things related to the long river of creation, the long river of creation began to tremble slightly. The waves produced by the trembling overlapped in the void, converged, and finally turned into a voice. Through the long river, you can enter the area of the Tao Master. Come, I'll wait for you here. The voice was very calm, but it went straight into the hearts of the itinerant cultivators, shocking them all. An indescribable desire surged out from the depths of their hearts. This was not an emotion drawn out by the voice, but an emotion that had long been hidden in the depths of their hearts. It was just an emotion that was covered by countless distracting thoughts. Although the itinerant cultivators kept saying that they hated the disciples of the Tao Master and that they wanted to destroy all the disciples of the Tao Master. However, deep down in their hearts, they were actually extremely envious of the disciples of the Tao Master. They were envious of the perfect cultivation environment created for them by their seniors. They were envious of the supreme inheritance that they possessed. They were envious of the fact that they could look down on itinerant cultivators from an extremely high position. However, because of their pride and because of their own experiences, they could not and did not want to express their envy, which turned into an inextinguishable hatred. But now, the voice was saying that they had the opportunity to enter the cultivation place of the Tao Master, and the opportunity to obtain the cultivation environment of the Tao Master. This kind of envy was anesthetized, so there was no need for them to restrain themselves. Naturally, they would show it. It was also at this moment that some of the itinerant cultivators, who were more sensitive to their own abilities, saw through their own hearts and understood the complicated feelings they had towards the disciples of the Tao Master. They could not help but have an inexplicable complicated expression. Before the itinerant cultivators could have any complicated feelings, a huge door appeared on the surface of the long river of creation every few light years. These doors seemed to be made of an indescribable material. Each of them seemed to be indomitable, and any cultivator of a normal size would be as tiny as an ant in front of them. The material that made up the door was extremely sturdy, and it constantly emitted an indescribably strong sense of existence. Any existence that was within 100 million light-years of the door would be able to discover the existence of the door and would involuntarily look at the door. Such a strong sense of existence fused with the surrounding long river of creation in an indescribably strange manner. There was no obvious sense of transition between the two. It felt like the door itself was completely condensed from the power of creation. All the doors were different, and each door had its own unique characteristic. The various fine patterns on the door, the various faintly discernible runes, and the various unimaginable shadows could be said to be unique. The length of the entire long river was calculated in billions of light-years. Even if there was a door a few light-years away, the final number would reach a point where it could barely be calculated in billions of light-years. However, with such a large number of doors, no two were the same. Every door was most suitable for the essence of the long river of creation, and they were perfectly fused with the operation of the long river of creation. It felt like the long river of creation had naturally given birth to a door. The existence of the door was obviously for people to pass through. At this moment, the many itinerant cultivators in the domain of itinerant cultivators all understood that the way to enter the long river that the senior mentioned was probably through these doors. After understanding this, the itinerant cultivators all became excited. They even cast aside their previous concern for whether Luofan was alive or dead. For cultivators, the only thing that they truly cared about was themselves. When their own interests were not prominent, they naturally would not be stingy with their attention to anyone that they cared about. However, once this attention affected their own interests, they would immediately disperse this attention. They would directly direct all their attention to their own interests. The creation energy inside seems to be repelled by the door. The closer we are to the door, the thinner the density, and the further we are from the door, the denser the density. The itinerant cultivators gathered around each door studied the essence of the door, and they became more and more surprised. How could they not know how important this characteristic of the door was to them? One must know that the restriction that prevented them from using the creation energy perfectly was that there was too much of it in the long river of creation, and the density was too high. It even exceeded what they could bear. Once they entered, even their bodies and minds would be completely eroded, assimilated, and completely disappeared. Under such circumstances, the appearance of a door that gradually changed the density of the creation energy was simply a way for them to adapt to the creation energy. It gave them a chance to adapt to the increasingly dense creation energy step by step, and finally reach a level where they could perfectly adapt to the creation energy in the long river of creation. In the end, they would be able to move freely in the long river of creation, fly freely, and use the creation energy to accomplish whatever they wanted. Understanding this, many itinerant cultivators with a stronger adventurous mentality rushed straight into the door after some rough experiment. They directly plunged into the power of creation that had become inexplicably thin on the front of the door. Although it was extremely thin creation energy, compared to the state of these itinerant cultivators, the strength of this kind of creation energy was ultimately unbearable. Almost all the itinerant cultivators' bodies were directly eroded by the creation energy the moment they plunged into the door. Their entire bodies were dyed pitch black, and even the nature of the power within their bodies, their souls, their life source, and their life essence were constantly being changed by the creation energy. Clearly, they were still severely damaged. However, it was still not to the extent of disappearing like the avatars, projections, and other itinerant cultivators who did not plunge into the long river of creation through the door. It's really true. As expected, I can gradually adapt to the creation energy through this door. The itinerant cultivators watching outside were filled with surprise at this moment, and their eyes began to light up. The changes of these itinerant cultivators in the door were fatal in the eyes of other living beings, and even other cultivators of lower levels. However, to these itinerant cultivators, it was only a slightly more troublesome change. Regardless of whether it was the itinerant cultivators who were suffering or watching, they all knew clearly that they could endure this change. The itinerant cultivators who plunged into the door shone continuously. The part of their bodies that had been eroded and assimilated by the creation energy suddenly retreated, and then rapidly spread again, forming a tug-of-war. In this tug-of-war, the speed at which the itinerant cultivators' bodies were being eroded and assimilated kept increasing. Clearly, the itinerant cultivators' bodies were constantly adapting to the erosion of the creation energy. This performance, which was no different from the original result, made the itinerant cultivators outside even more excited. Immediately, more itinerant cultivators entered the door and endured the powerful erosion and assimilation of the creation energy, trying their best to improve their adaptability to the creation energy. There were simply too many doors in the long river of creation. In addition, the door itself was rather huge compared to the bodies of the itinerant cultivators. Therefore, even though there were many itinerant cultivators, it did not seem crowded at this time. The fight for the order to enter the door that should have appeared did not appear. The entire itinerant cultivator domain showed an indescribable sense of order, a strong sense of order that had almost never appeared in the itinerant cultivator domain. While many itinerant cultivators were trying to enter the door, in the depths of the long river of creation, a figure quietly floated in the endless creation energy, calmly watching all the changes in front of him. This figure was naturally Luofan. At this moment, his eyes reflected the entire long river of creation, reflected the countless doors on it, and also reflected the countless itinerant cultivators who were either preparing outside the door or trying to adapt to the powerful creation energy within the door. Everything was so insignificant in his eyes, causing him to faintly feel that he was in control of everything, an indescribable feeling of being in control of everything. It's still too early. Looking at everything in front of him, he suddenly muttered, and an inexplicable light flashed in the depths of his eyes. At this moment, there was a three-legged cauldron in his hand. And in the depths of the three-legged cauldron, there was a fist-sized hole. The endless power of creation, that is, the pitch-black power that filled the Tao Master's domain, constantly gushed out of the hole and converged into the river that was billions of light-years long. Although the water in the river was constantly dissipating into the void due to the emptiness of the outside world, it did not seem to have decreased at all. Chapter 22-25. This fist-sized hole was connected to a location in the Tao Master's domain. It was a location that corresponded to the strange power in Luofan's hand. In other words, at this moment, the boundless creation power that filled the river of creation that spanned across the entire Tao Master's domain was only formed after the creation power of the Tao Master's domain seeped into this fist-sized hole. At this moment, the endless pitch-black power around the world cluster of Luofan's main body turned into a huge vortex that continuously rotated around his world cluster. The boundless Genesis energy flowed into the depths of his world cluster through the vortex and eventually gathered in the small ball of energy in his hand before disappearing without a trace. Through this ball of energy, it was transmitted to the rogue cultivator's domain and integrated into the river of Genesis. In terms of speed alone, given the scale of the river of creation that spanned across the entire Tao Master's domain and the speed at which the creation power surged into the Tao Master's domain, it would probably take at least hundreds of millions of trillion years for the river to take shape. However, at this moment, the time that the river took to appear was not even a year, let alone hundreds of millions of trillion years. This strange contradiction was definitely enough to make ordinary living beings confused and feel that their worldview had been overturned. However, for an existence at Luofan's level, this could not be any more normal. There was no other reason than the existence of time. In the pitch-black power that was called the creation power by the itinerant cultivators, time was only one of its characteristics. In other words, the creation power had already included time in it in some unimaginable and mysterious way. Obviously, for this kind of thing that already contained time, using time to measure it was a biased approach. Of course, it was impossible to obtain the correct conclusion. In other words, not to mention that less than a year corresponded to hundreds of millions of trillion years, even a blink of an eye corresponded to hundreds of millions of trillion years, or a blink of an eye corresponded to hundreds of millions of trillion years. Obviously, such a biased approach would not happen to Luo Fan. At that moment, he didn't care about the conflict of time transfer at all. He only carefully adjusted the river of creation, slowly turning it into the shape he needed and guiding the itinerant cultivators into the depths of the river of creation. Suddenly, his brows twitched, and a faint smile hung on his face as he muttered, "I didn't expect that someone would actually discover the truth so quickly." As he muttered, his gaze pierced through the power and crossed the barrier between the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain. It shone directly on the river of creation and locked onto a certain door on the river of creation. At this moment, there was an itinerant cultivator that was charging towards the depths of the river of creation while enduring the endless corrosive effects of the creation energy. During this process, his body was constantly being eroded, assimilated, and destroyed by the power of creation in the river. However, unlike other itinerant cultivators, his mind wasn't shaken at all. He didn't feel any negative emotions like despair because of any changes to his body or even any changes to his life origin. It was precisely because he didn't have such emotions that after the power of creation eroded, assimilated, and destroyed his body, it quickly began to reconstruct his life origin, his spirit, his power, and his body according to his mind. And the reconstructed body was quickly eroded, assimilated, and destroyed by the power of creation. Just like that, it fell into an endless and seemingly hopeless cycle. This itinerant cultivator was a youth that looked to be about 16 or 17 years old. He had a delicate face and a thin body. However, his eyes revealed an indescribable firmness and unimaginable wisdom. At that moment, his mind didn't waver in the face of this almost hopeless situation. He didn't slow down in the slightest, as if he was searching for something crucial. The door he entered was the one that was closest to the original deep pool. In other words, it was the closest door to where Luo Fan's clone projection was. As such, he was heading towards the deepest part of the river of creation, which was equivalent to heading towards where Luo Fan's clone projection was. Based on his current speed, it would take him a few years at most to reach where he was and meet him in person. He's too impatient. At that moment, an itinerant cultivator outside the door sighed. It seemed to be a pity, and an inexplicable sorrow. Indeed, according to his theory, the power of creation shouldn't be dangerous. It'll only bring him pain at most. However, that's only a theory. He's simply playing with his life by going there without enough experiments, another itinerant cultivator sighed. The two of them were good friends with the wandering cultivator who looked to be around 16 or 17 years old. Before entering the door, the itinerant cultivator had discussed his theory with them. He even invited them to experiment with his theory and search for the source of the river of creation. He wanted to see if he could use the purest and most condensed power of creation to open up his own group of worlds and truly start his cultivation on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. However, it was obvious that his theory was too radical. Even if they were good friends, the two itinerant cultivators didn't dare to gamble with their lives. Therefore, in the end, the three of them went their separate ways in front of the door. The young rogue cultivator firmly believed in his theory and personally headed to the deepest part of the river of creation. The two of them, on the other hand, planned to adapt to the power of creation step by step like other rogue cultivators. After adapting to a certain concentration of the power of creation that was sufficient for them to cultivate, they would borrow the power of creation to open up a cluster of worlds and begin their path of cultivation. This door was the closest to the source of the river of creation, so it naturally held a special meaning in the eyes of many itinerant cultivators. Therefore, even if the door in the river of creation allowed the itinerant cultivators to be more evenly distributed, there were still over 100,000 itinerant cultivators gathered here, which was at least a few thousand times more than if they were evenly distributed, at this moment, compared to the pity and sorrow of the two best friends of the young cultivator. The other itinerant cultivators who didn't know what was going on scoffed at the young cultivator's choice. To them, the young cultivator was just another rogue cultivator who was reckless and lost his life. They didn't pay too much attention to him, and it was impossible for them to feel any sadness because of this. On the contrary, there were even more rogue cultivators who were secretly happy that the young cultivator had disappeared. They were happy that his departure had opened up a spot for them, allowing them to enter the door a little earlier to adapt to the power of creation. The young cultivator naturally didn't care about the changes outside the river of creation. In fact, he didn't even care about his body at this moment. At this moment, he was wholeheartedly focused on his goal, which was to go deeper into the river of creation and head toward the source of the river of creation. In fact, to him, reaching this step had already exhausted all of his energy. After all, he was just an ordinary itinerant cultivator. He didn't even obtain a single strand of the power of creation, let alone open up his own group of worlds and the true path of cultivation on the fourth level. Therefore, although he had made an accurate judgment of the power of creation with his great wisdom and courage, putting himself on the edge of death and walking ahead of all the itinerant cultivators, however, he still underestimated the power of creation. At this moment, the power of creation was eroding, assimilating, and destroying him. It was not only affecting his body, his power, and his life essence, but it was also affecting his path of cultivation and all his past experiences. It was as if the power of creation had already surpassed the river of time and directly penetrated into his entire life experience. It appeared at any period of time and attached to every period of his life. It was born with him, started cultivating with him, took risks with him, grew up with him, experienced all the joys and sorrows of life with him, and finally stepped onto the path of Tao Master at the same time. They ascended level by level and finally arrived at the fourth level, the river of creation. This kind of unimaginable corrosive assimilation effect, the terrifying pressure it formed on his will was self-evident. At this moment, he even had a feeling that so long as he diverted a trace of his attention and created a trace of distracting thoughts, then he would be unable to resist this corrosion. He would truly lose himself, lose everything, and completely transform into a part of the energy of creation. It was because of this feeling that he couldn't shift his attention away from the only goal that existed in his heart at this moment. It could be said that he had even forgotten what he was going to do after reaching that goal. How could he still have the mood to pay attention to the changes outside the river of creation? It was precisely because he only had one target left that he neglected the mysterious changes that were taking place around his body during this process. At this moment, heaven and earth, world after world, and space-time after space-time appeared out of thin air around his body. They quickly collapsed and disappeared under the endless power of creation and couldn't be stabilized at all. It looked as if there were countless heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time constantly flashing around his body. If this young cultivator could see this, his understanding of the power of creation would definitely improve greatly. Perhaps he would soon be able to find the correct method to build a group of worlds that far surpassed all of the independent cultivators in the territory of independent cultivators. But it was a pity that, at least for the time being, he still couldn't pay attention to this. Moreover, it could be predicted that he wouldn't have the energy to pay attention to this in a short period of time. Only when he arrived at his target, which was where Luo Fan's clone was at this moment, would he be able to divert his attention from his target. Only then would he be able to notice the countless flashes of time and space around him. Of course, by that time, perhaps the changes around him would be different from now. He has great wisdom and courage. Even if he isn't a disciple of the Tao Sovereign, as long as he has enough opportunities, he will be able to hold his own against the Tao Sovereign's disciples. Luo Fan looked at the young cultivator and thought to himself. With this thought, he didn't hesitate. The projection of his clone in the river of creation suddenly raised his hand and grabbed at the young cultivator. In an instant, the young cultivator felt the fluctuation of the power of creation around him suddenly become more terrifying. The pain that he endured, the feeling of his history being infiltrated, and the feeling of his past being infiltrated suddenly became extremely strong. His mind was in a trance with this change, and his perception of the changes in the outside world became increasingly blurred. After an unknown period of time, his heart trembled. He found that the terrifying pressure from the power of creation around him had completely disappeared. What replaced it was an indescribable feeling of emptiness. At a glance, the place where he was had turned into a starry sky that was enveloped by the power of creation. Or rather, it was a group of worlds that was surrounded by extremely dense power of creation. Above this group of worlds, he could clearly feel that every heaven and earth, every world, and every space-time was transmitting an aura that he was extremely familiar with at all times. Those world clusters, in a trance, seemed to be him from the past. From those heaven and earth, those worlds, those space-time, he could clearly sense the heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time that he had intentionally or unintentionally created in the past. "This is my history," the young cultivator murmured. With this realization, he vaguely felt that he had fused with the entire group of worlds around him. Every breath he took, every action he took, he could mobilize the infinite power contained in the group of worlds. At this moment, he felt that if he were to face his past self, he would definitely be able to completely erase his past self with a single glance. So it turns out that after creating a group of worlds, one can actually become this powerful. He murmured. An indescribable complex emotion flashed in his eyes. There was joy, shock, and an indescribable hatred in his eyes. There was naturally no need to mention joy and shock. It was because of the magical effect of the endless power of creation around him. As for the hatred, it was because of the Tao Masters factions that had separated the domains of the Tao Masters from the rogue cultivators' domains. After all, if they hadn't separated the two domains, he would have achieved what he had today hundreds of millions of years ago. Therefore, the more powerful he felt now, the more he hated the actions of the Tao Masters factions in the past. But how did all of this happen? Why don't I have any impression of it at all? Then, this doubt flashed across the young cultivator's mind. He felt that he should still be trekking in the depths of the long river of creation in the rogue cultivator's domain. How did he end up here in the blink of an eye? And he had actually created a group of worlds that belonged to him? This made him feel as if he had lost a certain part of his memory. At this moment, if the young cultivator could see through the endless power of creation around him, he would discover that he was not in a calm region of the power of creation, but above an incomparably huge vortex of the power of creation. His group of worlds was like a small water droplet above the vortex. It continuously spiraled around the vortex, vaguely showing signs of being thrown into the center of the vortex, which was a group of worlds that was tens of thousands of times larger than his own. How long will it take to find out? At the center of the vortex, Luo Fan watched all of this, and such thoughts flashed across his mind. Everything that had happened to the young cultivator was naturally Luo Fan's doing. Previously, his clone projection in the long river of creation had directly grabbed the young cultivator and easily teleported him to the depths of the three-legged cauldron, which led to the domain of the Tao Masters. Through the small passage, he was directly sent to where his main body was. As for why the young cultivator did not feel anything during the process, it was obviously a matter of course. After all, Luo Fan was an expert who could easily defeat the fourth senior brother. The gap between him and the individual cultivator, who was much weaker than the disciples of any Tao master, was too big. It would be an overestimation of his strength to say that there was a huge gap between him and the individual cultivator. How could the individual cultivator notice anything unusual? After being sent to the Tao master's domain, due to the soaring concentration of the power of creation, it instantly poured into the young cultivator's body, into his own timeline, and directly integrated with all of his past experiences. In a way that surpassed his senses, it directly pulled out all the heaven, earth, world, and space-time that he had created in the past, whether intentionally or not, out of the river of time, and constructed this group of worlds. In other words, from the moment the young cultivator entered the domain of the Tao Master until now, almost no time had passed. At the very least, to this young cultivator, not even a bit of time had passed. Chapter 22-26. The young cultivator was immersed in the boundless and wonderful feeling of having his own world. He did not even have the time to dig into himself, so how could he pay attention to the changes in the environment that he could not see or understand at all? At this very moment, it was as if he had fused with the entire world cluster. His billions of years of cultivation seemed to have walked out from the river of time, fusing with him in an unimaginable manner. He was no longer in a state where he was covered by the river of time and the successive time periods. Instead, he was in a state that existed side by side and appeared in his heart at the same time. Along with this change, endless inspiration flashed in his heart at all times. Endless light of wisdom and inspiration appeared out of nowhere at all times. Although living beings were all themselves in different periods of their lives, different periods of time and different environments formed a completely different mentality. Moreover, the mental state, wisdom, and inspiration of oneself at different times were completely different. For example, some people would have an outburst of inspiration at certain times of the day, and all sorts of incredible and mysterious ideas would appear one after another. On the other hand, some people would completely fall into a state of stupidity at certain times of the day. They would even need a long time to eat and drink before they could react. This was just an ordinary person's day. If it was magnified to a lifetime, the situation would be even more obvious. If one was in the state of a baby or a teenager, their learning ability would be more than 1,000 times stronger than when they were old. Not to mention, the flexibility of thinking and the outburst of inspiration would reach their peak during puberty. Once this stage was exceeded, it would continuously weaken. This kind of change in an ordinary person was obviously reasonable in the case of a cultivator. Moreover, because the lifespan of a cultivator had become extremely long, the difference between before and after was countless times greater than that of an ordinary person. Under such circumstances, at this moment, the young cultivator felt that all the experiences, inspiration, willpower, and mentality in his life burst forth at the same time and appeared in his heart at the same time. It was easy to imagine how different this feeling was from before. It could be said that at this moment, he felt that he had found his true self. He had surpassed all time and obtained everything that he had lost in the past. This indescribable feeling finally turned into an ultimate sense of perfection. It was as if he had truly reached the state of perfection in his life at this moment. He had truly achieved his true self. This feeling of perfection surpassed all the feelings of perfection he had ever felt before. No matter if it was the innate golden immortal realm or the realms above that could bring about perfection, they were all extremely far away from this feeling of perfection. After all, this sort of perfection already contained all the past perfections, and it could be said to be the product of the combination of all past perfections. So my path of cultivation had such an oversight. Suddenly, an indescribable sense of fear appeared on the young cultivator's face. As it turned out, through the outburst of inspiration and the flash of thinking that he had found in the river of time, He finally discovered the fatal shortcoming that he had neglected before, which was of great importance to his path of cultivation and might even cause all his achievements in cultivation to collapse in the end. The moment he discovered the flaw, the many worlds, and space-time within the cluster of worlds underwent a subtle change. Vaguely, every world and every piece of space-time was undergoing a subtle adjustment. During this process, they were constantly communicating with other worlds, and space-time in various aspects, whether it was in terms of power, substance, or even spirit. Through this exchange, they were faintly reconstructing a more subtle and mysterious system, which in turn caused a corresponding change to his path of cultivation. This was the most basic use of the cluster of worlds. The cluster of worlds was grabbed from the river of time by the power of creation, using its own mysterious power. It was the sum total of all the worlds, and space-time that a cultivator had created since he had stepped onto the path of cultivation. It could be said that this existence was the embodiment of all his experiences in the past. Under such circumstances, they interacted, fused, and interacted with each other. Naturally, it was equivalent to all his experiences in the past adapting, adjusting, and fusing with each other. After such a change, the result was naturally a perfection and supplement to his path of cultivation. In this state of full concentration, the young rogue cultivator naturally did not care about the direction of the cluster of worlds. Unknowingly, the cluster of worlds had unknowingly revolved around this huge vortex for who knows how many thousands or tens of thousands of times. The distance between it and Luo Fan's cluster of worlds had also shrunk to a point where it was about to come into contact with them. Vaguely, the layer of consciousness world on the surface of Luo Fan's cluster of worlds, which was originally immersed in the consciousness world of many Tao masters, was already showing signs of coming into contact with the cluster of worlds. Based on the current situation, the young cultivator's cluster of worlds seemed to be gradually sticking close to Luo Fan's cluster of worlds, and the consciousness world might come into contact with it at any time. Unfortunately, it seems that I won't be able to discover it after all. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. From this, it was clear that the young cultivator had not discovered his current state as he had expected, and thus did not burst forth with sufficient resistance. The moment Luo Fan sighed, the layer of light on the surface of his own cluster of worlds shook slightly, and instantly came into contact with the young cultivator's cluster of worlds. In a flash, it began to spread along the surface of the young cultivator's cluster of worlds, and in the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped the young cultivator's entire cluster of worlds. At this moment, no matter how immersed the young cultivator was in his own cluster of worlds, no matter how immersed in his path of cultivation, he could no longer ignore the changes that had spread throughout the entire cluster of worlds. "What is this?" He looked up in shock. With this look, he discovered that his cluster of worlds was enveloped in an indescribable layer of light. The endless power of creation that could be seen at a glance outside the cluster of worlds had been completely replaced by that light. It was as if his cluster of worlds had been forcefully swallowed by something that was constantly glowing. Relying on his familiarity with the cluster of worlds during this period of time, with a thought, he frantically mobilized the power of the cluster of worlds. Waves of mystical power surged violently at this moment and began to rush towards the layer of light that enveloped the entire world cluster. Crack, 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 indescribably terrifying rumbles came from within the light, and a terrifying shock wave began to be released from the light. However, the release of this shock wave was not like ordinary shock waves that swept in all directions. Instead, it seemed to be restricted by some indescribable power, and it directly condensed in the direction of the young cultivator's cluster of worlds. It was as if it had been shot out from the muzzle of a cannon, sweeping through his entire cluster of worlds. Oh no! The young cultivator had a look of extreme horror on his face. He tried his best to manipulate the power of the cluster of worlds to resist the shock wave, but in the end, he discovered that the effect was rather limited. Before the power of the cluster of worlds condensed, the shock wave had already swept through countless lands, worlds, and space-time. When the power condensed and came into contact with the shock wave, countless lands, worlds, and space-time had already been torn apart by the shock wave. The young cultivator felt his mind become hazy, as if some of his experiences had been forcefully dug away. Although the shock wave was produced after the power of the cluster of worlds collided with the light, it was clearly not an ordinary shock wave. It contained all sorts of indescribable mysterious power. After coming into contact with the power of the cluster of worlds, the shock wave dispersed, but the power completely fused with the power of the cluster of worlds. It instantly spread throughout the entire cluster of worlds, and finally, using the cluster of worlds as a springboard, it directly condensed in the center of the cluster of worlds at this moment, completely enveloping the young cultivator. So powerful! The young cultivator only had time to sigh before his body froze and his eyes became dull. It was as if he had suddenly turned from a living thing to a dead thing. At the same time, the endless vortex of creation power that had a great effect on the outside world seemed to have not discovered the young cultivator's cluster of worlds. It allowed the cluster of worlds to stay where it was, while it gently bypassed the cluster of worlds and continued to revolve around Luo Fan's cluster of worlds. It went deeper and finally entered the fist-sized ball of power in Luo Fan's hand, disappearing within the domain of the Tao Master's disciples. At the same time, in the world of consciousness on the surface of Luo Fan's body, there was an additional world cluster. Among them, there were countless wills that were almost identical to the young cultivators. They were separated from different time periods and belonged to the young cultivator. Clearly, he had been thrown into the world of consciousness by Luo Fan, just like the disciples of the Tao Masters. The young cultivator's wills from different time periods had been thrown into the world of consciousness by Luo Fan. However, compared to the disciples of the Tao Masters, the young cultivator's cluster of worlds did not fall into chaos after his will was thrown into the world of consciousness. Instead, it continued to absorb the endless creation power from the outside world to repair the countless worlds, and spacetimes that were destroyed by the shock wave. It was as if the young cultivator's will was still in charge of everything in the world of consciousness. The reason for this was actually very simple. It was because the young cultivator's will that had been extracted into the world of consciousness lacked a trace of its core compared to the disciples of the Tao Masters. The trace of the core was still in the young cultivator's body, but it was not enough for the young cultivator to regain control of his body and his world of consciousness. He might not even be able to sense the existence of the trace of the core and sense anything with the help of the core. However, as long as the core existed, it meant that the young cultivator had not disappeared. It meant that the young cultivator was still in charge of the world of consciousness. As a result, the world of consciousness that was formed because of him naturally would not become as chaotic as the world of the disciples of the Tao Masters. Of course, the lack of the trace of the core did not have an impact on the young cultivator's will that had been divided into countless segments of time by the world of consciousness. In fact, it was the opposite. The impact was many times greater than imagined. It could be said that due to the lack of the trace of the will core, the world of consciousness could not cut the young cultivator's will and create the segments of time. Because of this, Luo Fan had no choice but to wait until the young cultivator's world of consciousness came into contact with his world of consciousness, causing the world of consciousness to fuse with the young cultivator's world of consciousness in a strange way. Only then was the young cultivator's will cut. The reason why the will could be cut after the fusion was very simple. It was because after the world of consciousness fused with the will that the young cultivator had fused with the world of consciousness had become complete. It seems that this is feasible. Luo Fan looked at this scene with a smile on his face. As he smiled, he made a grabbing motion in the air. Figures flew out of the fist-sized force in his hand and crossed space-time to enter the huge vortex of creation power outside the world of consciousness. The power of creation naturally seeped into their bodies and minds, even their histories and experiences. With them as a guide, it began to grasp the worlds, and space-time that they had opened up in the river of time, creating clusters of worlds around them. Those figures were naturally those who had sunk into the river of creation in the independent cultivator domain. At this moment, these rogue cultivators were like the young cultivator from before. In the blink of an eye, they discovered that they had been moved from the depths of the river of creation to their own world clusters, as if they had lost a crucial piece of memory. At that moment, all sorts of strange reactions appeared on the many cultivators. Some of the cultivators were hysterical as they destroyed everything in a frenzy. They wanted to know what was going on. Some were overjoyed and even prayed to the heavens in gratitude for Luo Fan who had done all this. Some were rather calm, as if they had seen everything that had happened, but they did not take it to heart at all. They were focused on experiencing the mysteries of the world clusters. The various reactions vividly displayed the personalities of the cultivators. Luo Fan naturally did not care about their reactions. At this moment, he continuously grabbed rogue cultivators from the river of creation and threw them into the huge vortex, allowing them to construct world clusters one after another under the control of the creation power. In just a few dozen breaths, he had already grabbed hundreds of thousands of rogue cultivators. After a short while, hundreds of thousands of world clusters appeared in the huge vortex. These world clusters varied in size, but compared to Luo Fan's world cluster, they were all incomparably insignificant. Compared to the vortex of creation power that was countless times vaster than Luo Fan's world cluster, it was even more minuscule. In the end, the world clusters followed the flow of the vortex and attached themselves to the surface of Luo Fan's world clusters. After being wrapped by the light, they still could not completely submerge the world clusters. Compared to Luo Fan's world clusters, the hundreds of thousands of world clusters were still extremely tiny. One could imagine the vastness of Luo Fan's world clusters. As the world clusters came into contact with the light on the surface of Luo Fan's world clusters, or rather, were wrapped by the light, the will of the rogue cultivators were pulled out of their bodies and thrown into the consciousness world. Then, they were quickly divided into countless subwills of different time periods and started a battle that belonged solely to them. For the many rogue cultivators, such a change could be said to be an unacceptable disaster, but for Luo Fan, such a change could not be more wonderful. Amidst the changes, his consciousness world continued to grow, and the battle between the subwills of the rogue cultivators vividly displayed the cultivation path of the rogue cultivators. Under the illumination of the rogue cultivators' respective world clusters, Luo Fan could feel an indescribable emotion at every moment, causing his own world clusters to undergo various subtle adjustments. This was actually the fundamental reason why Luo Fan left a bit of his core will for the rogue cultivators. After all, he had already treated these independent cultivators as resources for his cultivation and growth. He could divide their wills at will and watch them fight each other for the sake of their one and only self. Naturally, he would not show any mercy to the rogue cultivators. Naturally, he would not show mercy to the rogue cultivators and leave their world clusters intact. Chapter 22-27. For the next tens of thousands of years, Luo Fan continued to do this. He captured rogue cultivators from the rogue cultivator domain and threw them into the huge vortex, allowing the endless power of creation in the vortex to open up a group of worlds for them. Then, following the vortex, those worlds were finally connected to the world of consciousness. That's right, it was no longer thrown, but connected. After repeating the same action for tens of thousands of years, the number of rogue cultivators that he had caught from the rogue cultivators' territory had increased from hundreds of thousands to hundreds of billions. With so many rogue cultivators, even if the cosmos group of each rogue cultivator was far inferior to Luo Fan's cosmos group, it would still be many times larger than Luo Fan's cosmos group. In this way, it was impossible for these worlds to be directly thrown into the surface of Luo Fan's world group like insignificant dots, and be contained within the world group of consciousness. Except for the first layer of world group, which was still considered to be thrown into the surface of Luo Fan's world group, the other later layers of world group did not even have a chance to come into contact with Luo Fan's world group. They could only come into contact with the worlds of those individual cultivators who came into contact with Luo Fan's world group. Fortunately, the world of consciousness was not supported by any other material object, but a layer of fluid-like light that covered the world group. In this case, as long as the surface was connected, it would not affect the world group being connected to the world of consciousness, and it would not affect the owner of the world group being pulled into the world of consciousness. Obviously, after the first layer of world group was connected to the world of consciousness, its surface was already covered by the light that supported the world of consciousness. In this way, when the later layers of world group came into contact with it, they would naturally be wrapped in the light, and of course, they would also come into contact with Luo Fan's world group. In this way, the originally huge whirlpool became more than 100 times larger. At this moment, when it looked from afar, no matter where it was in the world of Tao Master, it was very obvious. It felt like a huge black hole that could devour the entire void and the entire domain of the Tao Master. If there were still disciples of Tao Master in the outside world, they would definitely try their best to stop Luo Fan. Maybe the same thing as summoning Senior Sister Mei from a higher level would happen again. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. All the disciples of Tao Master, including the fourth senior brother, had been taken into his own world group. They were thrown into the world group to participate in the reincarnation of heaven and earth, world, space-time, and contribute everything they had to the growth of heaven and earth, world, space-time. In this way, this kind of change, which obviously had a great impact on the entire domain of the Tao Master, did not attract anyone's attention and did not cause any accidents. It looked as if the entire territory of Tao Master was completely under the control of Luo Fan, compared to the great changes of the Tao Master's domain over the past tens of thousands of years. The changes in the rogue cultivator's domain were actually not inferior to the Tao Master's domain. After tens of thousands of years of development, the Long River was already completely different from what it used to be. Now, it had become the center of the entire rogue cultivator's domain. It became the main reference for all rogue cultivators and all cultivators to choose their own place of cultivation and residence. Incomparably prosperous settlements appeared in front of the portals. Among them, countless rogue cultivators gathered to form an extremely special civilization, a civilization of an unimaginably high level that studied the power of creation and was familiar with the power of creation. Any member of this civilization was a cultivator at the level of a Four Tribulations expert. Every move they made, every word they said, was enough to change the world. Because of this, the scale of this civilization was naturally imaginable. It could be said that if any civilization outside of the portal was placed in a big world, it would be enough to overthrow the whole world. It would cause a complete change in the situation of the world, provided that the Tao Master or true sage did not stop it. Such a terrifying civilization, at this time in the rogue cultivator's domain, could be counted in the hundreds of millions. One could imagine how terrifying it was, because for tens of thousands of years, all the rogue cultivators who entered the long river of creation had never come out. It was as if they had penetrated the long river and entered another domain, and it was as if they had directly melted into the long river. Therefore, by now, the many rogue cultivators had become more rational about entering the long river of creation. Although there were still rogue cultivators entering the portal and the long river at all times, most of them were already watching and studying the power of creation through other methods, looking for the safest way to obtain the power of creation. It was precisely because of this mentality of these rogue cultivators that the vast civilizations built outside of the portal developed to their current state, causing them to look forward to, use, and fear the power of creation. I've done some calculations. It has been a total of 73,212 years since the long river of creation appeared, and a total of about 82 billion cultivators have entered the long river. No one had ever been able to return from that place. Therefore, I think this long river is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy set up by a powerful figure to plot against us. In a certain civilization, a rogue cultivator was speaking to the ruler of this civilization, a rogue cultivator who had already established his own world cluster in the rogue cultivator's domain by collecting a huge amount of the power of creation, and had even basically perfected his world cluster. The ruler was surrounded by a mysterious power that belonged to a world cluster that had never appeared before the long river of creation appeared. Every move and every breath he took could bring great pressure to other cultivators who did not have a world cluster, making them feel as if a small movement from the ruler could completely crush them, kill them, and scatter their souls. It was also because of this that the rogue cultivators in this civilization acknowledged his position as the ruler. In other words, it was because of his great strength that this civilization could be born. This ruler looked like an extremely dignified middle-aged cultivator. His world cluster was far away from this civilization, but there was always a projection lingering behind him. The existence of this projection allowed him to immediately mobilize the supreme power of his world cluster to crush and destroy everything in its path. At this moment, as he listened to the words of the rogue cultivator before him, he looked impatient. You've mentioned this research countless times, but do you have any proof? I need proof. That's right. You people are always exaggerating things to scare people. What conspiracy? What conspiracy? That's impossible. Although they didn't return from the long river, any traces they left outside the long river mean that they are still alive. This is the case even for the weakest cultivator. Tell me, if there's really a conspiracy, why would this happen? Below him, another rogue cultivator said loudly. Any civilization that had a ruler would definitely have factions and conflict. It was obvious that this wandering cultivator belonged to a different faction from the previous one. Hearing his words, the rogue cultivator who spoke first had a solemn expression. Proof? Of course we have proof. After thousands of years of research and gathering the power of millions of people, we have found a way to prove this inference. Hearing this, the ruler was taken aback. It was the first time he heard such words. In the past, no matter how extravagant the theories of those researchers were, no matter how much they talked about golden lotuses emerging from the ground, once they were presented with evidence, they could only speculate, make logical assumptions, or think about what was the only possibility left. In short, he couldn't come up with any concrete evidence that he could support. This time, this researcher actually dared to say that he could produce evidence in front of him. This made him very curious. Don't tell me you want all the power of our entire civilization to come here to prove something, right? At this moment, the rogue cultivator who opposed said coldly. Hearing this, the ruler's expression changed. That was indeed possible. It was said that many researchers would ask for authority, resources, and strength from the rulers under the pretense that they would be able to produce some results or that they were lacking something. Among so many civilizations, it was said that many civilizations had fallen for this trick and used most of their power to conduct some illusory experiments. In the end, they lost everything. No, no, no. We are completely different from those scammers. This time, we have enough theoretical support to prove that if this investment is absolutely reasonable, we will definitely be able to obtain sufficient results. The rogue cultivator who spoke before hurriedly explained when he saw that something was wrong. Anything else was fine, but if they were treated as scammers who scammed funds, then they would lose everything. At this point, seeing that the others still had doubtful gazes, the rogue cultivator gritted his teeth and waved his hand. A large light screen appeared in front of him. On the screen, there were countless runes, lines, and words. In the blink of an eye, they had filled the entire hall, causing the entire hall to sink into the ocean of runes, lines, and words. It looked like even space had been replaced and supported by them. "How dare you!" The rogue cultivator who opposed roared at this moment and was about to teach this rogue cultivator a lesson. At this moment the ruler shouted, "Stop!" As he spoke, he looked at the endless runes, lines, and words with a burning gaze, as if he saw something that interested him. The rogue cultivator who released the light screen was actually quite nervous after releasing it. He was worried that the ruler wouldn't give him a chance and would directly throw him out. Now that he saw that the ruler was interested, he finally heaved a sigh of relief. He even vaguely felt a sense of pleasure from being able to stretch out. Then, he began to explain to the ruler. According to the entire process of the formation of the river of creation, the reason why the river of creation was able to take form is not only because of the endless creation energy, but also because there is a layer of formation covering the surface of the river of creation. It's a formation that we can't detect at all, but it is indeed producing effects. My method of proof is aimed at this formation. As long as we can obtain the structure of this formation and bypass it, we can bypass the door and explore the river of creation to obtain the essence of the river of creation. Even if we can't confirm the conspiracy within, we can still obtain the endless creation energy through that opening. At that time, we won't even need to enter the river of creation anymore. That way, we won't have to care about any conspiracy at all. The rogue cultivator went on and on. As he spoke, the countless runes, lines, and words constantly changed, forming a complicated pattern, showing how everything he said would be realized, showing what kind of power should be used, and what kind of operation should be carried out in certain places. He even explained the principles behind it, the possible dangers, and the difficulties that might be encountered, all of it wishful thinking. The rogue cultivator muttered, but he didn't say anything in the end. After all, according to the ideas that the rogue cultivator presented at this moment, it seemed that there was a high possibility that it could be realized. In that case, how can we prove that this is a conspiracy set up by an Almighty? You seem to have some reservations about what you said just now. It's not the key to making a judgment, the ruler said with a stern expression. His judgment was actually very simple. The ultimate goal of researching the rogue cultivator was just to provide a way to obtain the essence of the river of creation. This was as crude as asking an ordinary intelligent life on an ordinary planet to obtain eternal life through studying the universe. Could they find a way to live forever by studying the universe? Of course, there was no doubt about it. There were endless mysteries in the universe. If one really studied it deeply and touched the essence of life, obtaining eternal life was simply a matter of course. However, that was simply a huge detour. If one wanted eternal life, wouldn't it be easier to study the human body and the evolution of life? More direct? In the eyes of the ruler, the method that the rogue cultivator proposed was of the same nature. It seemed like there was a high possibility of success, but it was obvious that it was a huge detour. When the rogue cultivator heard this, a look of admiration appeared in his eyes. He said, "Your Majesty is wise. Actually, my method of confirmation is very simple. Our entire behavior can actually be regarded as a kind of test. It doesn't matter if we can obtain the essence of the river of creation, as long as we can draw out the power of creation freely and create a tributary, we will know if there is a conspiracy behind this." Hearing this, the ruler's expression changed, and countless rays of light shone in his eyes. Although the rogue cultivator's explanation was rough, at this moment, he completely understood and knew what the other party was thinking. If there was a conspiracy behind the river of creation, then if he was the one who set up the conspiracy, he would definitely not allow others to change the river of creation. He would definitely not allow others to draw out the creation force limitlessly and bypass him to complete their cultivation. In other words, if there really was a conspiracy, then no matter how meticulous the plan was, it would definitely not be able to draw out the creation force from the river of creation and endlessly pour it into this civilization to provide resources for the cultivation of all the cultivators in this civilization. The ruler thought about it and suppressed the impulse in his heart. He calmly said to the rogue cultivator, "Tell me the specific plan." Hearing this, the itinerant cultivator was both excited and nervous. He completely revealed an incomparably huge plan to the ruler. He talked about how many rogue cultivators were needed, what cultivation paths were needed, how many resources were needed, how many people were needed, what kind of publicity was needed, and so on. It took him a few days before he barely explained the entire plan. For a fourth tribulation powerhouse like him, no matter how long or how big the plan was, as long as he heard it once, he would not forget it. Therefore, the ruler did not ask anything else. After the rogue cultivator finished, he told him to wait for further instructions and sent him away. "Your Majesty, this matter is of great importance. I hope that Your Majesty will make a decision soon," the rogue cultivator said earnestly as he left. After the rogue cultivator left, the ruler raised his head and looked ahead. His eyes seemed to penetrate all the barriers in this civilization and directly saw the huge river of creation outside the civilization. He saw the endless creation force surging in it, and he seemed to vaguely see countless figures struggling and floating in it. "Your Majesty, this must not be done." The opponent mustered his courage and said loudly. These words drew the ruler's attention back. "Why not? This plan seems appropriate, but it is actually extremely dangerous. If it goes well, it will be fine. If it doesn't go well, our entire civilization will be destroyed." The opponent did not say it clearly and only gave a general point. However, it was enough for the ruler to understand what he wanted to express. If there was no conspiracy behind the river of creation, then naturally nothing would happen. They would be able to smoothly obtain a tributary of the river of creation and smoothly bypass the river of creation to obtain cultivation resources. However, what if there was a conspiracy behind it? In that case, how would the almighty figure who set up the conspiracy treat the ant-like civilization that was testing him? Would he laugh it off, or would he completely wipe it out in rage? Chapter 22-28. The ruler pondered for a long time and finally made a decision. Half a year later, the civilization in front of the portal became unprecedentedly lively. The number of itinerant cultivators in the entire civilization was more than 100 times more than half a year ago. With so many independent cultivators gathered in this civilization, the aura they exuded was vast and mighty. It was like waves constantly surging in all directions from the main body of this civilization. Anyone with a slightly sharp perception could clearly sense that something big was about to happen. "Everyone, I believe you already know my plan. What do you think?" The ruler of this civilization said to the many itinerant cultivators who were standing on the same level as him. In front of him, the itinerant cultivators who were at the same level were all enveloped in a power that belonged to the world cluster. Moreover, each of them exuded an indescribable majesty that was not much different from the ruler. These itinerant cultivators were none other than the rulers of other civilizations. In other words, they were existences that were on par with the ruler of this civilization. When the rulers heard this, they all looked disdainful. A female ruler said, "We're already here. Don't you know our attitude? Why are you still talking nonsense?" Hearing her words, the other rulers all had strange looks on their faces. They seemed to be a bit disdainful and impatient. When the ruler heard this, he smiled bitterly and said, "This matter is of great importance after all. If something goes wrong, none of us will be able to escape. Naturally, we need to be more cautious." There were tens of thousands of rulers here. In the past half a year, the ruler of this civilization had considered and calculated the plan time and time again. In the end, He revealed this plan to the rulers of the civilizations in front of the portal and invited them to participate in this plan. Even an ordinary person could see the reason clearly. It was clearly to let them help him share the danger, and also to give him a greater chance of getting a share of the river of creation. Facing the mighty beings behind the river of creation, the ruler of this civilization had no confidence at all. He had no confidence at all if he acted alone. Only by dragging the others into the water and gathering the strength of the other civilizations would he have a little bit of confidence. As for whether the rulers of those civilizations would agree or not, it was needless to say. When the river of creation was right in front of them, the fact that they could calm down and create a civilization outside the door meant that they were more vigilant against the river of creation than the other rogue cultivators. Under such vigilance, it was difficult for them to resist the temptation of being able to bypass the river of creation and obtain the boundless power of creation. In this way, as long as the ruler of this civilization expressed his thoughts, as long as the plan was not too ridiculous and had enough possibility of being realized, many of them would definitely be tempted. If they could drag the other rulers down with them, they would be even more duty-bound. Looking at the tens of thousands of rulers before him, the ruler of this civilization sighed inwardly. Back then, he had invited tens of millions of rulers, but in the end, only tens of thousands of rulers had arrived. This number was much less than what he had expected. Obviously, his plan did not gain the approval of all the rulers, but it should be enough. They've all brought the essence of their civilization. If this doesn't work, then I can only accept it. Such a thought flashed through the ruler of this civilization's mind at this moment. After having this thought, he focused and began to throw out all the information he had, explaining the various factors involved in the plan, the various difficulties, the various advantages, and the various things that required everyone's cooperation. None of the rulers here was weaker than him, and even their status was not much different from his. Under such circumstances, he naturally could not treat these rulers like his subordinates. Instead, he could only take out what he had in the most equal way and not hide anything from each other so that the rulers could discuss an implementation plan that everyone was generally satisfied with. It only took them half a year to gather the rulers. However, it took them more than 100 years to discuss a specific implementation plan that all the rulers were generally satisfied with. And even this completed plan needed to be adjusted continuously according to the encounters in reality and constantly changed according to the changes encountered in the implementation process. Fortunately, the many rogue cultivators who had built their own worlds had reached an unbelievable level of wisdom and strength. Therefore, even though there were so many uncertainties, it was not a problem for them. It could even be said that it was only by leaving so many uncertainties that they could work together perfectly and complete the mission of probing the river of creation before them. On a day after more than 100 years, the ruler of this civilization said to the many other rulers, "Since the plan has been made, let's get started." At this moment, the many rulers showed a confident look on their faces. This kind of behavior was already a huge change from the irritation they showed more than 100 years ago. Let's begin. After studying it so many times, I think we should have figured out all the possible situations. Next, we just need to wait for the implementation results, an elderly ruler said with a calm expression. Hearing this, the ruler of this civilization nodded. But a few days later, outside this civilization, outside the gate of the river of creation, tens of billions of rogue cultivators were densely divided into tens of thousands of camps. These tens of thousands of camps had gathered almost all the power of that civilization. At this moment, standing in the center of the tens of thousands of camps were the tens of thousands of rulers who had discussed with the civilization's ruler for more than 100 years before coming up with an implementation plan. At this moment, compared to when they were discussing the plan, there was a huge change. Back then, when they were discussing the plan in the palace, because they were all existences with equal status and strength, none of them wantonly released their powerful auras. Although they all looked rather extraordinary, it was still obvious that they were ordinary rogue cultivators. In contrast, at this moment, they were all displaying their power. Each ruler was surrounded by a terrifying power. Ordinary loose cultivators would tremble just by looking at them, as if their life source was under unbearable pressure. Even the void where the tens of thousands of camps were at had all sorts of subtle distortions during this process, forming all sorts of indescribable light and shadow. It was as if various worlds and space-time were continuously appearing and disappearing during this process. These various changes were faintly discernible, as if they existed and didn't exist at the same time. It was extremely mysterious, making the many rogue cultivators around them become well-behaved and not dare to cross the line at all. "Let's begin," the ruler of that civilization said softly. This soft shout directly penetrated the barrier of the endless void and entered the ears of the tens of thousands of rulers, allowing them to hear it clearly. Under the seat of the civilization's ruler, the itinerant cultivator who had proposed that plan was extremely excited. His eyes were constantly shining with spirit light. There were countless runes, lines, and words constantly flashing and circling in his eyes. "It's finally about to begin. My plan will definitely succeed. I will definitely be able to create a tributary of the river of creation, a tributary that is completely not controlled by the Almighty behind me." This thought kept reverberating in his mind. With this thought in mind, the speed at which his eyes flickered became faster and faster. What he was doing now was naturally deducing the specific implementation plan of this plan that had been collectively discussed by many rulers. However, although he had mentioned the beginning and proposed the rough implementation of this plan, in the end, it was only the beginning. Now, this plan that had been discussed by many rulers for so many years was already worlds apart from the beginning. Even though his head was constantly emitting smoke from his deductions, the light in his eyes was already flickering like two light bulbs. However, he could only deduce a vague outline. As for the specific content of this outline, he was still at a loss and could not understand it at all. In fact, even though he was able to deduce this outline, it was already because he had the advantage of being the one who had proposed this plan in the first place. If not for this advantage, he wouldn't even be able to deduce this outline. So the gap between worlds without and without worlds is actually this huge. After a long time, he stopped deducing and sighed inwardly. This itinerant cultivator was in existence with an extremely meticulous mind, so he naturally knew that the most fundamental difference between him and the rulers was the world group. In other words, the rulers were only stronger and had an advantage over him because of the world group. Now, the greater the gap between him and the rulers, the greater the improvement that the world group would provide to the cultivator. In this case, he could not help but look forward to the outcome of this plan even more. If the plan really succeeded, he would naturally be able to obtain endless creation energy. When that time came, it would obviously only be a matter of time before he could open up his own world group and reach the level of the rulers. This inexplicable anticipation filled him with fighting spirit and motivation. He only hoped that the rulers would quickly start the plan and succeed. Just as this itinerant cultivator was thinking about this, the many rulers had already completed their preparations and began to move in an extremely mysterious order. There was light, air, water, time flow, space flow, matter flow, and so on and so forth. Many different existences charged out from the tens of thousands of factions. The itinerant cultivators in these factions, including the rulers they represented, as well as the many itinerant cultivators who did not have a world group or were originally inconspicuous, all activated their own powers in an extremely subtle way, unleashing their own gods' abilities and displaying their prowess. The various powers, gods' abilities, and various powers gathered together in a mysterious way and became the existences that were released from that faction in a specific state. These existences came from all over and finally gathered in one place in the void. They gathered together in an extremely strange way and began to undergo all sorts of indescribably familiar and profound changes. These changes were a little like the creation of heaven and earth, a little like the construction of a world group, and more like the birth of a certain mysterious power. Such a change shocked the itinerant cultivators who could see this scene. They felt that their horizons had been broadened. Some with high comprehension even comprehended all sorts of subtle principles that they had never thought of before. In a trance, their bodies became restless and they yearned for the creation energy in the long river of creation to realize their own comprehension. The numerous existences of light, power, matter, time flow, space flow, matter flow, and so on and so forth continuously condensed in the void. An indescribable aura was constantly released from the condensation and surged in the void. The subtle fluctuations spread out and gradually affected the long river of creation. At this moment, the rulers all widened their eyes and looked at the long river of creation. This fluctuation was the first step of the plan. It was also the most crucial step. According to their deductions, this kind of fluctuation through such a complicated method should be able to trigger some changes in the long river of creation and cause a certain formation to appear on the surface of the long river of creation. However, that was only a deduction after all. Whether the deduction would succeed or not, whether their subsequent plans could proceed, depended on whether the first step could succeed. There must be a reaction, there must be a reaction. This was the thought that echoed in the minds of the rulers. At this moment, although nothing could be seen on the surface, there was a feeling of apprehension surging in the depths of their eyes. At first, the long river of creation did not change because of this. It was as if the fluctuation was just an ordinary fluctuation that was not enough to trigger any reaction. However, as time passed, as the fluctuation continued to seep in, and as the power continued to surge, the surface of the long river of creation began to flicker with traces of light. Although the light was extremely weak and tiny, the rulers were overjoyed when they saw it. The long river of creation looked just like a pitch-black river. Although it was a grand existence that spanned across the void and pierced through the entire void, it was not obvious if one looked at it with the naked eye. If there were ordinary mortals here, they might even think that it was the same as the surrounding void. And now, the strands of light appeared on the surface of the long river. Although they were extremely weak and tiny, against the pitch-black background, they seemed to be outlining the long river. Moreover, as time passed and the fluctuation continued to seep in, the light that appeared on the surface of the long river became more and more obvious and concentrated. Finally, at a certain moment, a rune appeared on the surface of the long river due to the tireless efforts of the rulers. The appearance of this rune caused the rulers' eyes to be filled with ecstasy. Although this rune was only an insignificant small rune in the entire long river of creation, it seemed so insignificant. However, its appearance represented a fact. The first step of their plan had succeeded. "Everyone, what are you waiting for?" The ruler of the civilization shouted softly at this moment. After this shout, all the rulers exerted their strength at the same time. More powerful existences were released from their camps and poured directly into the amalgamation of many existences in the center. They frantically distorted and changed the state of the amalgamation, causing the amalgamation to change wildly in the process. The countless lights that originally existed in the amalgamation began to combine in an extremely special way, gradually forming a bridge. An arched bridge. After the bridge appeared, the aura that emanated from the bridge began to change. It no longer stimulated the river of creation, but it began to envelop the runes that were appearing from the river of creation, increasing in number and density. In the end, it formed an indescribable fusion with the runes, causing the runes to gradually resonate with the fluctuation. It seemed as though they were about to be manipulated by the fluctuation and undergo some kind of change. At this moment, Luo Fan's doppelganger projection in the depths of the long river of creation was shocked. He broke away from the state of constantly grabbing the individual cultivators in the long river and throwing them into the domain of the Tao Master. With a single sweep of his senses, he was able to clearly see everything that was happening in the outside world. I can't believe you guys actually thought of such a method. If I had simply used the arrangement in the long river, you guys might have really succeeded. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind at this moment, and he wore a faint smile on his face. For him, whether the long river of creation was present or not, it actually did not affect him throwing the individual cultivators into the domain of the Tao Master to help his world cluster evolve. The reason why he created the long river of creation was just to make the individual cultivators unable to discover him and stimulate their subjective initiative. Chapter 22-29. The arched bridge formed by the power of tens of thousands of factions continued to extend in the void. The runes that surfaced on the surface of the river of creation had unknowingly become densely packed. The surface of the river of creation within a radius of thousands of light-years from the portal they were facing was soon filled with runes. This drastic change naturally triggered a drastic change in the river of creation, causing the river of creation to shake violently. The power of creation in it began to surge, gradually affecting the power of creation in other areas and the portals in other locations. With this change, many itinerant cultivators who were adapting to the power of creation in the river of creation could not withstand the drastic change and were swept into the depths of the river of creation, although they were only sent into the hands of Luo Fan's avatar projection faster. But for the many itinerant cultivators who were watching from the outside, this was because they were swallowed by the river of creation. This drastic change simply increased the danger level of the river of creation by 1,000 times. How could the itinerant cultivators not be concerned? At that moment, countless probing methods poured into the river of creation to help them find the source of this change. The tens of thousands of rulers did not use any means to conceal themselves. They simply gathered outside the river of creation and used their means. Naturally, it was not difficult for them to detect them. Not long after, the itinerant cultivators who were searching for the source of the change in the river of creation found them one by one. Gazes gathered from all directions and shrouded the tens of thousands of itinerant cultivators. What are they doing? Are they trying to destroy the river of creation? Ordinary itinerant cultivators naturally would not think so much and would not divert their thoughts to the almighties behind the river of creation. To them, the existence of the river of creation was a great thing. Although they were wary of the river of creation, it was only against the danger of the endless power of creation in the river. Under such circumstances, when they suddenly saw so many fellow almighties using such a decisive method to deal with the river of creation, they naturally thought that they were destroying the river of creation. Thinking about how they were destroying this long river, even though the itinerant cultivators were wary of the itinerant cultivators who had gathered to form a civilization, they could not help but feel angry. It's one thing for you to band together and seize more resources, but now you want to cut off our path of cultivation. This was simply an irreconcilable hatred. At that moment, independent cultivators began to quickly make their way towards the 10,000 camps from all directions. Streaks of light streaked across the sky, leaving behind extremely long traces in the air. Due to the sheer number of itinerant cultivators that had gathered, it looked as though a huge fan-shaped light had appeared out of nowhere in the void of the river of creation. As for why it was so close to the river of creation, it was naturally because the itinerant cultivators had gathered in front of the various portals in the river of creation and were relatively close to the river of creation. At first, only those rogue cultivators with strong detection abilities were the first to take action because they were able to discover the source of the mutation faster. However, as more and more itinerant cultivators took action, the news of the source of the mutation was gradually made known to other itinerant cultivators. Naturally, more and more itinerant cultivators took action, Although there were many itinerant cultivators who had gathered together to form a civilization, they were ultimately only the majority of the many itinerant cultivators in the entire domain of itinerant cultivators. The remaining itinerant cultivators who had not joined any civilization were many times fewer than the total number of itinerant cultivators. However, compared to any civilization or even tens of thousands of civilizations, they were many times larger in scale. Under such circumstances, the many itinerant cultivators were mobilized and gathered in front of the portal where the civilization was located. The scene was simply like a surging wave that was constantly surging towards this region. An inexplicable pressure gradually pressed down on the essence of the tens of thousands of civilizations. You're just some weaklings who can't see the situation clearly. How dare you bare your teeth? Sensing this change, one of the 10,000 rulers sneered. To them, it was the right thing to do for the many itinerant cultivators to band together and deal with the river of creation as a whole. In this way, those itinerant cultivators who were unwilling to join a civilization were naturally the kind of ignorant people who could not see the situation clearly. How could they possibly be interested in such an existence? In particular, they had become the rulers of this civilization for so many years, and each of them had opened up their own relatively complete world clusters. Compared to the past, their strength had increased tremendously. No matter how many itinerant cultivators there were, they would not be much of a threat to them. Due to these various conditions, at this moment, these rulers were only disdainful and annoyed by the scale of the itinerant cultivators that was many times larger than theirs, but they were not afraid at all. The many itinerant cultivators gradually stopped and continued to pile up around the tens of thousands of factions. Gradually, they seemed to turn into a colorful cloud that surrounded the tens of thousands of factions. I didn't expect you to really take action. You really don't want to live anymore. An itinerant cultivator who had obviously heard some news yelled furiously. The only reply he got was silence. The elite forces gathered by tens of thousands of civilizations were focused on breaking the restriction formation on the surface of the river of creation and guiding the creation energy out of the river of creation. If it wasn't necessary, why would they pay attention to the outside world? Why would they have the time to be distracted? What are they trying to do? An itinerant cultivator asked the other itinerant cultivators in confusion. They want to break the structure of the river of creation and let the creation power escape. An itinerant cultivator who knew a little more said indignantly, "How dare they? The reason why our itinerant cultivator domain has not been drowned by the creation power is completely because of the restriction of the river of creation. If we break the river, the boundless power of creation will spread out. Won't we all be devoured by the power of creation?" The rogue cultivator yelled with a horrified expression. Although the river of creation had been born for a long time, compared to the many itinerant cultivators who cultivated for hundreds of trillion years, this amount of time was not much different from taking a nap and cultivating. Therefore, almost all the itinerant cultivators still clearly remembered the whole process of the river of creation appearing. Even those who did not see it appear with their own eyes had already figured out the whole process through inquiries over the years. In this way, almost all of them clearly knew that when the creation power emerged, the changes that should have appeared should have spread in all directions and spread to the entire itinerant cultivator domain. It was just that after so many years of understanding of the creation energy, if it had developed in the same direction, then they would have been completely immersed in the creation energy. They would have been constantly eroded and assimilated by the creation energy, and they might even have been completely devoured. Just when things were about to go out of control, the Almighty who guided the creation power back then, who was said to be an expert who went against the path of a Tao master and returned from a higher level, created a huge formation. He used his physical strength, great power, and great divine sense to restrict the spread of the creation power, created the river of creation, and even opened countless portals for them to enter the river of creation. Based on all these circumstances, the structure of the river of creation was a life-saving barrier for them. That mighty being who had created this river was clearly their savior, but now, not far away from them, the itinerant cultivators who were huddled together actually wanted to break the structure of the river of creation and release the creation power again, so that the entire itinerant cultivator domain would be immersed in the boundless creation power. This was simply evil. Stop them. We must stop them. If they succeed, we will all be finished. An itinerant cultivator roared. When the other itinerant cultivators heard this, their eyes flashed with murderous intent. Maybe we should wait and see. Suddenly, an itinerant cultivator said, "What do you mean? Are you going to wait until they destroy the river of creation and all of us have no hope before you act?" Another itinerant cultivator said angrily, "No, no, no, that's not what I mean. I just feel that they don't seem like the kind of people who would commit suicide. They are also in the itinerant cultivator domain. Since they dare to do this, perhaps they have their own plans and judgment. Things might not necessarily develop to the most tragic extent." The itinerant cultivator who was previously doubtful said hurriedly. Although he was not a weakling, he could not help but feel nervous when so many experts of the same level as him stared at him as if they wanted to tear him apart. What other possibility is there? They already have a complete world group now. Even if the itinerant cultivator domain is filled with boundless creation power, they have a foothold. In this way, the entire itinerant cultivator domain is filled with boundless creation power, which is even more perfect for them. Another itinerant cultivator said angrily. This caused all the itinerant cultivators to fall silent. The world group was the goal of their cultivation on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. It was also the beginning of their cultivation on the fourth level. It could be said that without the world group, no matter how long they stayed on the fourth level, they would only be wandering outside the door. Ascending to a higher level would be an unattainable goal. Under such circumstances, although they could not have a very basic understanding of the world group like the countless disciples of the Tao Masters in the realm of the Tao Master, they even knew how to use various divine senses and various methods to make the heaven and earth, world, and spacetime in the world group form a world group system that completely followed their cultivation Tao. However, through various methods and deductions of various legends, they knew how incredible the existence of a world group was, and how much stronger they were than before. They also understood that the existence of a world group could indeed resist the creation power. In fact, if the world group was complete and perfect enough, it could even completely repel the creation power, and provide a foothold in the boundless creation power for all living beings. At this time, many itinerant cultivators actually believed the judgment of that itinerant cultivator. They felt that the cultivators of those civilizations were doing this to completely envelop the entire itinerant cultivator domain in the creation power. After all, in that case, the existence of a world group would be able to obtain the creation power more easily. And those without a world group would also have more opportunities to obtain the creation power by attaching themselves to the ruler of a world group. However, although almost all of them believed this judgment, the mentality of the many itinerant cultivators was different. Some itinerant cultivators deeply hated it, and even wanted to immediately perish together with the itinerant cultivators who were huddling together. Some were thinking about how to curry favor with them. After all, for itinerant cultivators like them, cultivation, improvement, and ascension were the most important things. Apart from that, everything else, such as dignity, was secondary. If they could curry favor with the itinerant cultivators who had a world group so that they could cultivate better, have more opportunities to obtain the creation power, and open up their own world group, they would definitely not be stingy with their heads lowered. It was precisely this difference in thinking that caused the itinerant cultivators, who originally shared a common hatred for a common enemy, to unknowingly weaken a lot. In fact, their plan to immediately attack and directly interrupt the itinerant cultivator's actions could not be carried out immediately, and the scene came to a standstill. The itinerant cultivator's thoughts fell into chaos, but the 10,000 rulers on the other side had no intention of stopping with their rhythm. At this moment, the arch bridge had unknowingly extended to the long river of creation, and it gradually came into contact with the endless runes on the surface of the long river. At this moment, endless power began to surge wildly. The endless runes on the surface of the long river seemed to have suddenly been touched by something, and they began to become chaotic. In the eyes of the rogue cultivators, the result of this change was that the formation that was originally perfect and powerful, and could even firmly restrict the power of creation within a long river, began to produce an extremely uncoordinated chaos at the point where the arch bridge came into contact with it. Vaguely, a large amount of Genesis energy began to gather towards the chaotic area from all directions. The terrifying pressure gradually caused the formation to become even more chaotic in this area. Faced with this change, the surrounding itinerant cultivators finally knew that they could not wait any longer. If we let them continue, it will be irreversible. What we need to do now is stop them. At this moment, an old man shouted. His shout received the response of many itinerant cultivators, but it also caused some of them to have an indescribable gloominess in their eyes. After saying that, the old man immediately took action. A terrifying might that could faintly suppress all the other itinerant cultivators erupted from his body, and he drew a mysterious trajectory in the void as he charged towards the camp of 10,000 people. The location he was charging at was not the strongest point of the camp, nor was it the weakest point, nor was it the center. Instead, it was a camp that seemed ordinary among the 10,000 camps, but it bore the responsibility of unifying a large portion of the camp's power. If the overall structure formed by these tens of thousands of camps was treated as a formation, then the formation would be extremely powerful. At this moment, the camp that was being attacked was a node of the formation. Although it was not the kind of node that would cause the entire formation to collapse once it was destroyed, it was still a rather important node. Once it was destroyed, the efficiency of the formation would be greatly reduced. Obviously, although the old man did not make a move earlier, he had been carefully observing the huge structure formed by the elites of 10,000 civilizations. At this moment, an indescribably terrifying power was released from the camp. With a single sweep, he had already wiped out the power that was directed at this camp, causing the void to clear up once again. "You're courting death!" The ruler of the camp roared furiously at this moment. Clearly, he was the one who attacked just now. However, he had been wholeheartedly controlling the arch bridge to destroy the formation on the surface of the river of creation. Now that he suddenly diverted some power to deal with the power that was charging at him, his support for the arch bridge weakened a little, causing the arch bridge to seem to dim a little. After all, they were facing the river of creation that could overturn the entire territory of itinerant cultivators. Even the rulers of the various civilizations did not dare to be careless. Just now, they had all unleashed their full strength. If they diverted even a little bit of power, it would affect their plan and affect their ability to destroy the formation on the surface of the river of creation. It was precisely because of this that these rulers ignored the siege of the many itinerant cultivators and ignored the various ridiculous speculations the itinerant cultivators had about their thoughts. "How dare you attack His Majesty? You're courting death!" At this moment, roars came from all directions among the spectating itinerant cultivators. Chapter 22:30. Many itinerant cultivators had expected this internal strife, causing them to come to a sudden realization. However, more itinerant cultivators were shocked. They stood there with blank expressions, unable to react at all. Although the old man had endured so many attacks, he was still a cultivator who surpassed ordinary itinerant cultivators after all. He would not be completely destroyed by the attacks before he could react. Before the attacks were about to reach him, He had already reacted and made the wisest response. He had chosen to escape with his ability, even if he had made countless strict preparations. He might not be able to withstand the numerous attacks that were flooding over at this moment. Moreover, things had happened in a hurry. He had not expected that those rogue cultivators would be so decisive. If he had tried to block them, how could he have withstood them? It could be said that he only had one choice at this moment, and that was to hide. Fortunately, the old man was ultimately a powerhouse among the itinerant cultivators. His dodging techniques were extremely clever, and he eventually disappeared into the core of the countless attacks at the last moment. Crack! Swoosh! All sorts of strange noises rang out from the core of the attacks. In the blink of an eye, the surrounding space had already been filled with countless illusory figures. It was as if there were countless heavens and earth, countless worlds, and countless annihilations. In that instant, the entire space had been engulfed. Such a huge commotion naturally could not be limited to a small area. Not far away from the old man, many rogue cultivators were caught in the crossfire. They either dodged or blocked the aftershocks of the attacks. It looked like a school of originally calm fish had suddenly scattered in all directions. The scene was intense beyond imagination. Despicable, shameless. The itinerant cultivators who had dodged the attacks roared furiously. However, all they could do was roar angrily. After all, they had too many opponents at this moment. They were truly alone. Even though they were furious, they could only dodge for the time being. How dare you dodge? How dare you resist instead of apologizing for offending His Majesty? One of the itinerant cultivators who had launched an attack roared furiously. He immediately changed his attack and turned to another void. Over there, the old man from before appeared in an instant. Obviously, he'd moved to this area of space after he'd avoided the countless attacks that were at the center of those attacks. The voice of the attacking rogue cultivator gave a signal to the other rogue cultivators, causing them to shift their attacks from their original state of missing their targets to the void. In the face of this wave-like attack, the old man was furious, but he could only choose to dodge again. However, at this moment, someone else finally made a move. Streaks of light shot towards the divine abilities, might, strength, and luster from all directions. In the blink of an eye, they had already clashed with the divine abilities, causing an earth-shattering impact. Powerful shock waves constantly spread out in all directions, causing the surrounding space to be destroyed in the blink of an eye, along with all sorts of bizarre light. You can join us if you want. Using your companions as a ladder is a little too much. A voice rang out amidst the terrifying impact, echoing in the ears of many rogue cultivators. It was obviously the voice of the rogue cultivator who had stopped the other rogue cultivators from attacking the old man. Hearing this, the expressions of the rogue cultivators who had attacked the old man didn't change at all. They didn't even feel ashamed at all. After all, since they dared to betray their original camp in this situation, it was obvious that they had made up their minds and were ready to risk everything. This kind of rebuke was naturally within their expectations. In this case, how could they change their expressions because of such a small rebuke? It seems like you guys also want to harm His Majesty. You deserve to die as well. Immediately, one of the rogue cultivators said directly. The target of the attack instantly changed from the old man to the rogue cultivator who had spoken. For these rogue cultivators, the merit of killing one enemy was naturally far inferior to the merit of killing a large number of enemies. Now that these rogue cultivators had given them something to use against them, how could they not seize it? At this moment, the scale of the internal conflict began to expand at an unimaginable speed. Originally, there were only a few hundred rogue cultivators attacking the old man, but in just a few breaths, it had become millions of rogue cultivators divided into two camps attacking each other. With this change, their ability to influence the plan created by the tens of thousands of rulers was naturally greatly reduced. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the arch bridge forcibly penetrated the river of creation and opened a small hole on the extremely mysterious formation on the surface of the river of creation that could only accommodate the arch bridge. With this change, the countless runes on the surface of the river of creation around the arch bridge became more and more chaotic. Countless runes lost their positions and trajectories, and they began to collide with other runes. As they collided, they were simultaneously damaged and even annihilated at the same time. These collisions, these damages, and these annihilations caused an even greater impact, causing the runes in a wider area to become chaotic. These collisions increased, and these damages became more and more common, causing the annihilations to appear almost continuously. Under this change, the boundless creation power in the river of creation also reached a peak. In the end, when the runes crossed a certain boundary, the boundless creation power was like a flood that broke through a dam, completely breaking through the runes around the arch bridge. The moment it shattered, an extremely strange sound resounded throughout the entire rogue cultivator's territory, making all the cultivators in the rogue cultivator's territory suddenly understand that a shocking upheaval was occurring somewhere in the rogue cultivator's territory. Boundless creation power gushed out from the hole on the surface of the river of creation and directly drowned the arch bridge. Although the arch bridge itself was a product condensed from the essence of many civilizations, it was still much weaker than the creation power. In particular, the moment the creation power broke the shackles, the arch bridge became even more fragile. Almost immediately, it shattered in the torrent of the creation power. In the blink of an eye, it turned into countless fragments and rushed towards the source of the arch bridge along with the torrent, which was the tens of thousands of factions formed by the rulers of tens of thousands of civilizations. It's over. It's over. The rogue cultivators' eyes were filled with despair, and almost all of them lost their voices. Those who could speak could only repeat similar words over and over again. As for their internal strife, it was naturally impossible for them to continue. For the traitors, this phenomenon had already achieved their goal, so there was naturally no need for them to take action anymore. For those who originally objected, this situation meant that all their efforts had failed, so there was naturally no need for them to take action anymore. "Please take us in, Your Majesty." The traitors only shouted at this moment, their eyes filled with anticipation, excitement, and uneasiness. Although they seemed to have obtained the promise of the rulers of the civilizations with their resoluteness previously. In fact, everything was just what they thought they were doing. The rulers of those civilizations did not give them any hints at all, and it was not even certain if they were aware of their existence. Therefore, at this moment, when things came to a head, they began to feel uneasy, and could not display the resoluteness that they did when they attacked brazenly. Obviously, none of the rulers of those civilizations cared about these rogue cultivators. To these rogue cultivators, the rulers of those civilizations were breaking the long river of creation, allowing the creation power to directly fill the entire territory of the rogue cultivators, bringing great convenience to their cultivation. However, to the rulers of those civilizations, their goal was not what the rogue cultivators thought at all. Their goal was not to fill the entire territory of the rogue cultivators with the creation power, but to create a tributary of the long river of creation that was under their control. Under such circumstances, how could they possibly care about these rogue cultivators who had guessed wrongly? Even if these rogue cultivators had paid a huge price to help them previously, it was impossible to change their determination. At this moment, the various powers, lights, and abilities emitted by the tens of thousands of camps suddenly changed. From the arched bridge that was originally gathered in the void, it transformed into another form. Starting from the long river of creation, it continuously outlined and combined in the void, forming one complex structure after another, forming unimaginably complex formations in the eyes of the rogue cultivators. As the boundless creation power gushed out, it didn't just charge forward. Instead, it expanded and spread in all directions of the long river of creation. It was expanding and spreading endlessly. In this way, if there were no restrictions on the power, the hole on the surface of the long river of creation would definitely continue to expand until the entire long river of creation was completely severed, allowing the endless creation power contained in it to be released without any restrictions. It would truly spread across the entire territory of the rogue cultivators, causing the entire territory of the rogue cultivators to fall into the state that the rogue cultivators were worried about. At this moment, as the mysterious and complicated formations created by the tens of thousands of camps that contained all sorts of unfathomable profundities began to appear, gradually enveloping the surface of the long river of creation that was getting larger and larger, the power that was spreading in all directions was instantly contained. PFFF. At this moment, countless cultivators from the tens of thousands of camps spurted out blood, dyeing the tens of thousands of camps red. It looked as if a blood-red mist had enveloped the camps. What a strong pressure! One of the rulers of the civilization grunted and spat out the words that seemed normal but actually contained boundless shock. Compared to the rogue cultivators under him, he naturally performed much better. Of course, he didn't vomit blood. However, even if he didn't vomit blood, his expression changed. It was obvious that the impact he endured was not ordinary. Hold on. If we can't hold on, we're doomed. A ruler of a civilization roared at this moment, but he used his powerful will to encourage the other rulers. Is there a need to say that? Who's more foolish than anyone else? The ruler who said that the pressure was strong sneered. As he spoke, the rulers released the power of the world group that was many times more powerful than before. It poured into the camp, and through the camp's control channel, it was transmitted to the formations that were spewing out the power of creation, doing their best to strengthen the formations. After all, they had been planning for such a long time. Although the changes in front of them were intense, it was actually within their expectations. At this moment, although they were all shocked by the terrifying impact of the creation power, none of them panicked. Not a single one of them panicked. The formations created by the many camps continued to extend along with the creation power, trying their best to keep up with the creation power, and trying their best to limit the creation power that had turned into a river that was rapidly extending toward them. They actually want to control the long river of creation. The rogue cultivators outside finally saw what the rulers of these civilizations wanted to do, and they were all extremely shocked. One must know that the existence of the long river of creation was billions of times greater than them. Even if their imagination was increased by 100 or 1,000 times, they did not dare to imagine that they would be able to control the long river of creation one day. Not to mention controlling it, they only dared to think about moving freely in the long river, and they did not dare to be sure that they would be able to achieve it. However, under such circumstances, those rogue cultivators who were clearly just a group huddling program actually dared to have the wild idea of controlling the long river of creation and drawing out a tributary from it. How could they not be shocked by this ability, this method, and this boldness? As for the traitors who had brazenly betrayed them, their expressions changed constantly. This situation was indeed a good thing for the other rogue cultivators. It was enough for them to avoid the danger of the entire rogue cultivator territory turning into an extremely harsh environment for them, and they finally had the right to continue living. However, to them, this was the worst news they could have ever received. Without that harsh environment, wouldn't what they had done previously be in vain? How would those rogue cultivators who had been betrayed look at them afterward? How would the powerhouses who had been attacked by them treat them? At the thought of those various terrifying methods, the rogue cultivators could not help but feel numb, and their expressions became increasingly ugly. If this was any other time, many rogue cultivators would probably mock them and even attack them. However, it was clear that this was not normal. Right now, the rulers of those civilizations were working hard to tame the tributary that extended from the long river of creation. If they were not careful, the worst situation that they had expected would happen. It could be said that they were already on the brink of life and death. They did not even have the time to be nervous and work hard to find a stronger chance of survival for themselves. How could they still have the mood to mock these traitors? To deal with these traitors? Give it to me. Blit. The ruler of the civilization outside the door roared at this moment. With this roar, the eyes of the rulers of the various camps flickered, and the methods that they used to control this camp began to change. As the methods changed, the formations that surrounded the tributary of the long river of creation began to expand continuously, surging continuously, and gradually seeping into the creation power. PFFF, PFFF, PFFF. At this moment, sounds of people vomiting blood came from the various camps again. It was all the rogue cultivators who vomited blood at the same time. That's right, this time, it was not almost all of them, but all the rogue cultivators vomited blood. Moreover, this scale was at least 10 times stronger than before. Some rogue cultivators even spat out their own internal organs from their throats. After such a change, the blood-colored mist in the tens of thousands of camps became denser, and the tragic aura skyrocketed many times compared to before. As they paid such a huge price, the tributary of the long river of creation that gushed out gradually diverged from the original one, turning into one after another, forming waves after waves. From the looks of it, there were tens of thousands of them. It just happened to correspond to the various camps. This appearance looked as if tens of thousands of strands of hair that were originally clenched together suddenly scattered in a certain position, scattering into a dense mass. With this change, the terrifying impact of the tributary that originally converged together began to be dispersed to the tens of thousands of even smaller tributaries, weakening the terrifying impact that was originally impossible to resist to the point where there was a trace of hope to resist. Sensing the changes in the tributary, the rulers of the various civilizations were overjoyed. We can succeed. Such thoughts flashed through their minds. At this moment, just as the rulers were looking forward to the final result, congratulatory voices came from all directions. Congratulations to the leaders for creating a new era. Along with the congratulatory voices, countless figures wrapped in the power of the worlds appeared around the tens of thousands of camp. Chapter 2231. You're going too far. We're just doing this for the safety of the independent cultivators. You have to admit that you can't hold on much longer, one of the independent cultivators said calmly. The independent cultivator who spoke had the power of the world group around him. In fact, this power was much stronger than the power of the world cluster that lingered around the 10,000 rulers. They existed in the void, and as they surged, illusory figures were born in the void. It was as if a world, and a space-time were appearing in all directions. Looking at the number of cultivators that had appeared, it was at least 100 times more than the total number of cultivators in the 10,000 factions. It was almost impossible for so many cultivators to appear out of nowhere, but at this moment, their appearance seemed so natural, as if they had always been here. In fact, compared to the tens of thousands of independent cultivators, they had been here for a long time, but had only revealed themselves now. Hearing this voice, the expressions of the 10,000 rulers who were originally here became extremely ugly. Shameless. When the new cultivators appeared, they followed an extremely subtle and mysterious law, and the positions they appeared in were extremely exquisite. They vaguely formed a formation that was even more powerful than the tens of thousands of camps combined. At this moment, they completely ignored the argument of the higher-ups. Their power, and abilities all surged out and began to combine in various indescribable ways. They produced a supreme power that was countless times stronger than the 10,000 factions combined. Among the 10,000 factions there were 10,000 rulers. Compared to the tens of thousands of factions, there were over 100 times more cultivators, but the number of rulers was not just 100 times more, but over 1,000 times more. While the low-level cultivators were setting up the formation according to their plan, the rulers were all preparing. The power of their world group was brewing in their bodies, waiting for an opportunity to erupt. The 10,000 rulers were so furious that they wanted to tear the new peach pickers apart with their teeth. However, they did not have the determination to perish together with them. At this moment, they did not even dare to withdraw the formation that had restrained the 10,000 tributaries of the river of creation and used their power to fight against the new independent cultivators. At this moment, they even had to make way for the new independent cultivators to avoid a huge conflict between their formation and the formation they had set up. Under this kind of rational and helpless cooperation, the new formation began to cut into the original formation bit by bit, gradually covering the original formation, and gradually enveloping the tens of thousands of tributaries. Seeing this, the eyes of the 10 million rulers that had just appeared lit up. The power of their world group erupted and poured into the formation that their subordinates had set up. It flowed along the formation and merged with every aspect of the formation. It turned into the foundation of the formation and made the formation even more stable and powerful. At this moment, the formation began to exert force and forcefully cut into the 10,000 tributaries of the river of creation. As countless runes surged madly, an incredibly powerful backlash was fed back through the incredibly powerful formation. It was transmitted into the bodies of the newly appeared rogue cultivators, causing all of them to groan in an instant. Some of the rogue cultivators could not withstand the backlash and spat out blood. Although the situation was slightly better than the tens of thousands of rogue cultivators, it was not much better. As for the original 10,000 independent cultivators, they were already experienced and relaxed their power at the critical moment. Although they suffered a certain backlash, it was not to the point where their bodies were injured to the point where they had to spit out blood to alleviate the backlash. At this moment, their performance was much better than the 100 times the number of rogue cultivators outside. Seeing that the rogue cultivators were covered in a bloody mist, the rogue cultivators couldn't help but have a hint of schadenfreude on their faces. Obviously, they held a grudge against the rogue cultivators for plucking the fruits of their labor. At this moment, the river of creation that had been separated began to tremble slightly. Every tributary of the river of creation that had been divided into 10,000 small tributaries continued to be cut and divided under the effect of the new formation. Every tiny tributary naturally divided into thousands of even smaller tributaries, surging towards the vast void in an even more open manner than before. This scene was like the roots of a large tree being separated from the main body of the river of creation. In the beginning, there was only one main root. Although it was twisted and irregular, it still looked orderly. However, after the main root extended for a certain distance, it suddenly split and grew 10,000 roots that were 10,000 times smaller than the main root. Because these tens of thousands of tiny roots extended in all directions, the area they covered was several times wider than the main root from before. After that, the tens of thousands of roots extended a certain distance. Then, they actually cut again and became even finer. From each tiny root, over 1,000 tendrils were once again branching out. In this way, the river of creation that was originally only a tributary turned into tens of millions of tributaries. The area covered by the tributaries of the river of creation was more than 100 times wider than when there were 10,000 roots previously. Just like that, when the roots extended to the area where the many itinerant cultivators were, the total area covered by the roots had increased to a radius of several thousand light-years. Hurry up and use whatever means you have. You can pluck the fruits of your labor, but if you mess things up after plucking the fruits, you can go to hell. The ruler of this civilization roared at this moment. His voice was filled with anxiety and helplessness. If there were only tens of thousands of roots, he could still think of a way to seal the river of creation so that the power of creation would not be endless and spread endlessly throughout the territory of the rogue cultivators. However, although each of the roots had become 1,000 times thinner, their number had also increased by 1,000 times. This number was no longer something that he could control. Therefore, even if he was extremely unwilling and wanted to use his teeth to bite those independent cultivators who plucked the fruits of creation into pieces, he had no choice but to place his hopes on those people. After all, if he couldn't handle it, the river of creation would wreak havoc, and the entire territory of the independent cultivators would be finished. By then, perhaps the rulers could rely on their own worlds to survive freely in the endless power of creation, but what about the others? Could they take all the independent cultivators in the territory of the independent cultivators into their own worlds? Even if they were willing to open their worlds without reservation, their worlds could not accommodate so many independent cultivators. Don't worry, since we dared to make a move, how can we not be confident? You just have to watch. At this moment, a ruler who appeared later smiled faintly. As he spoke, the void in the surroundings began to distort, and the silhouettes of the world clusters appeared in front of the roots, blocking the path that the roots were extending. So, your worlds can actually sublimate to such an ability. No wonder you could appear here in such a strange way. The ruler of this civilization had an inexplicable look of resentment on his face. These independent cultivators did not obtain the true method of constructing a perfect world group, and could not use the most direct method to arrange the worlds according to their cultivation path. Therefore, they could only use a method similar to Luofan's, which allowed the worlds to naturally resonate with them and naturally change according to their own cultivation path. Moreover, because they did not have enough power of creation, this kind of natural adjustment could not be fully carried out. They could only change it bit by bit, and could not achieve what Luo Fan did in the territory of the Tao Master, where he could constantly adjust the worlds to his own cultivation path. In this way, it would be almost impossible for them to be like the disciples of the Tao Master and gather all the power that the world group could bring. In other words, if these independent cultivators with their own worlds fought against the disciples of the real Tao Master, none of them would be able to compare to the disciples of the Tao Master. Moreover, the gap might be huge. This was the fundamental reason why the disciples of the Tao Master did not choose this kind of cultivation method. However, this did not mean that the cultivation of the independent cultivators was not unique. Moreover, on the contrary, because of their intermittent improvement, the power of the world group that they could obtain grew step by step, allowing them to obtain a special characteristic that the Tao Master's disciples did not have. That was, they had unknowingly sublimated all kinds of indescribable mysterious abilities from the power of the world group. These mysterious abilities were formed according to the different cultivation paths of the independent cultivators, and according to the degree of adjustment and perfection of the world group of the independent cultivators. It could be said that the special ability that each independent cultivator had sublimated from a certain stage of the power combination of the world group was unique. Just like the superpower that the legendary people with superpowers obtained, for most of the independent cultivators who owned a world group, the abilities they obtained from the combination of the power of the world group at a certain stage were not very useful. They were not as useful as their own methods, so they were not taken seriously by those independent cultivators. However, there were countless abilities, and most of them were useless. Obviously, some of the abilities that the independent cultivators obtained were not useless. Instead, they had unimaginable uses, and could even make those independent cultivators achieve achievements that would leave countless ordinary independent cultivators dumbfounded because of their abilities. At this moment, among the newly appeared independent cultivators, the ability of one of the rulers clearly had the qualifications to make ordinary independent cultivators dumbfounded. "You flatter me." A faint smile appeared on the ruler's face as he replied. As he smiled, his expression suddenly changed, and many pores on his body suddenly spewed out a mist of blood, directly turning a large area of the void around him blood red. "Ha ha ha ha!" Seeing this, the ruler of the civilization suddenly laughed out loud. "You really used your own ability to block all the power of creation? Who do you think you are? Do you think you are the Almighty who opened up the long river of creation? Let's see how many lives you have to die." The ruler of the civilization laughed out loud, and his expression was filled with boundless anger. This was also to be expected. He had painstakingly contacted so many rulers, gathered so many people's wisdom and abilities, and cut open a hole in the long river of creation in an environment that almost all the independent cultivators thought was impossible, allowing them to see the dawn of transcending the control of the long river of creation. However, when this dawn appeared, some rulers that he had contacted before but rejected him forcibly interfered and reaped the fruits of his labor. One could imagine the grievance and anger that this brought about. He was already very rational not to perish together with these rulers immediately. At this moment, the large number of independent cultivators in the surroundings had already dispersed and disappeared without a trace. In this place, only the two nested formations that these rulers and their many elites constructed, as well as the long river of creation that turned from 1 to 10,000, and then into 10 million, were left. Behind these two nested formations was the civilization outside this door dozens of light years later. There were also a large number of independent cultivators among them. These independent cultivators were cultivators who attached themselves to this civilization and were also a part of this civilization. At this moment, they were all horrified as they looked from afar at the numerous roots that continued to spread and seemed to be about to completely drown the formations, as if they could see boundless waves surging towards them. An indescribable despair made them stand there in a daze. These independent cultivators who attached themselves to the civilization but were not selected to build the formations that were made up of tens of thousands of factions were existences that had been abandoned. They did not even know what exactly was happening, and their ability to respond was not small compared to the many elites. Many of them were caught in a dilemma at this moment. They wanted to leave, but they did not know where to go. They wanted to stay, but they did not dare to be sure that it was safe here. It was because of this dilemma that they behaved this way at this moment, and they could not float away like the other independent cultivators. It stopped. At this moment, an independent cultivator in this civilization exclaimed. This exclamation made many of the independent cultivators feel at a loss, and they could not help but look at the end of the long river of creation and the end of the roots. On the roots, the illusory figures of the world clusters rapidly evolved and quickly changed from their original illusory state to the appearance of the real world clusters. At this moment, the creation energy that was constantly extending and pushing forward stopped. It was as if the illusory figures of the world clusters were constantly absorbing it. A world cluster might have an infinite space inside, but from the outside, its size could be big or small. Perhaps it could fill all the voids, or perhaps it could be as small as a speck of dust. As for how it would appear, it would depend on how the owner of the world cluster set it. It also depended on the thoughts of the people watching from the outside. At this moment, it had been far too long since the territory of the independent cultivators had been covered by the power of creation. Therefore, in the eyes of almost all the independent cultivators, the void without the power of creation was unknowingly regarded as an existence similar to the void in the universe. The scale of space in this existence was naturally closer to the scale of the void of the universe. In other words, the distance of light years didn't exist in the first place. It was just a special characteristic that the independent cultivators in the independent cultivators' territory gave the void. In this way, those clusters of worlds were naturally equivalent to clusters of nebulae that were neither too big nor too small in their eyes. Although the interior was extremely huge, it only looked like a galaxy from the outside. Therefore, at this moment, in the eyes of the many independent cultivators in the civilization, there were clusters of nebulae blocking the tributaries and constantly absorbing the creation energy from the tributaries. If that's the case, we might be able to completely block them, an independent cultivator mumbled with an indescribable look of anticipation on his face. They couldn't be more clear about the dangers of the creation energy. If they were completely covered by the creation energy, none of them were confident that they would be able to come out unscathed. Under such circumstances, compared to the independent cultivators who dared to join the various camps or even watch from the sidelines, they were more afraid of the domain of the independent cultivators' territory filled with the creation energy. It's indeed possible, but the prerequisite is that he can withstand the pressure of the river. At this moment, an inexplicable voice entered the ears of the independent cultivators. Shortly after, a figure appeared in the void. It was the figure of a legendary figure in the eyes of many independent cultivators, the figure of the Almighty who had endlessly helped the entire independent cultivators' territory. Chapter 2232. At this moment, Luo Fan was naturally nothing more than a clone projection. He hovered in the void in front of this civilization and watched the tens of millions of tributaries of the river of creation being forcefully blocked by the tens of millions of world clusters projections and devoured the boundless creation energy within. With his knowledge, he could naturally tell that the tens of millions of world clusters originated from the world clusters of itinerant cultivators. However, although the source was the world clusters, they were not the actual bodies of the world clusters after all. Instead, they were merely projections created by some sort of ability. After such projections absorbed boundless creation energy, they could naturally turn into reality. In fact, they could even cause the source of the projections, which was the world clusters, to move over and fuse with them through mysterious changes. However, at this moment, before they turned into reality, in order to support the existence of the projections of the world clusters, it was not the source of the world clusters, but the owner of the ability to project the projections of the world clusters. In other words, it was an itinerant cultivator who already had a world cluster. It was a ruler who ruled over a certain civilization outside a certain door in the river of creation. It was also the person who suggested, planned, and directed this operation to pluck the peaches. As such, the impact and pressure of the creation energy that the projections of the world clusters withstood would naturally be transferred to the ruler through this ability and be used on the world clusters themselves. Such pressure should have been enough to spread the creation energy to the entire itinerant cultivator realm. How could it be completely stopped by an itinerant cultivator? It could be said that at this moment, the itinerant cultivator was actually in a race against time. He had to turn the world clusters into reality as soon as possible and get them out of the projection state so that the pressure of the creation energy would be transferred to the world clusters themselves. If he could complete all of this before his body and mind completely collapsed, he would naturally be fine. Not only would he be unharmed, but the terrifying pressure would also allow his world clusters and his body to be greatly enhanced. In the end, his cultivation realm would take a huge leap forward. However, if he had been a little slower, he would have been unable to withstand the pressure before the projection of the world cluster could receive the power of creation. Then, the final outcome would have been his body and mind collapsing. He would have died and his soul would have dispersed. I wonder if he regrets it now? Luo Fan floated outside the civilization and muttered, "Greetings, Senior. Thank you, Senior, for creating the river of creation and providing us with hope for cultivation." At this time, many rogue cultivators knelt behind Luo Fan and shouted. No matter how dangerous the river of creation was, no matter where the individual cultivators who entered the river of creation went, no matter whether they died or entered the realm of the Tao Master as those optimistic fellows guessed, nothing could change the fact that the appearance of the river of creation had completely changed the cultivation prospects of all individual cultivators. None of them could change the fact that the creator of the river of creation had given them a ray of hope in their despairing cultivation prospects. A wisp of hope that they had painstakingly sought for hundreds of millions of years. Under such circumstances, since these rogue cultivators had recognized Luo Fan, how could they not come forward to express their gratitude? Moreover, they were now hoping that Luo Fan would protect them, so naturally, they could not withhold their gratitude. Luo Fan stood there quietly and faintly said, "There is no need to be grateful. I have my own plans, my own plans. Perhaps, in the end, you will regret your current gratitude." Listening to these ambiguous words, many of the rogue cultivators were secretly stunned, and all kinds of ominous premonitions arose in their hearts. Although these rogue cultivators were much less courageous than other rogue cultivators, after all, they were powerful existences who had entered the fourth level of the Tao Master Path through their own efforts. How could they be stupid? After hearing Luo Fan's words, they thought too much, and all kinds of doubts emerged from the bottom of their hearts. At this moment, all of their expressions changed dramatically and their eyes became somewhat inexplicable. Could it be that there really is a conspiracy? Could it be that he really set a trap for us? The scene fell silent because of the thoughts of the rogue cultivators. Luo Fan did not care about all of this. He just quietly looked at the tens of millions of tributaries of the river of creation and the tens of millions of worlds in front of him. As his perception circulated, he reflected the situation of every single world group and tributary into his heart. Very quickly, he confirmed which world group was in charge and who the ruler was. He narrowed his eyes and locked onto that rogue cultivator. At this moment, the rogue cultivator was constantly spewing out blood mist, and the power of the world group was constantly being released from his body. However, it quickly disappeared into the surrounding void, as if the surrounding void was a black hole that was frantically devouring everything. Compared to this ruler's tragic state, the other rulers did not fare much better. They were also spewing endless blood mist, and had also suffered great damage in the process. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan had to spend some effort to determine that the independent cultivator was the source, the true source of the group of worlds might. Otherwise, if he was the only one spewing blood while the others did not suffer any damage or change at all, even a fool would know that something was wrong with him and that he was the one under the greatest pressure. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. In a flash, he had already arrived before the projection of the world cluster corresponding to the leader. Although it was a projection of the world group of all participating rulers, there were still differences between the people in it. How could the world group of others be treated the same as his own world group? This ruler was not the kind of person who would absolutely sacrifice himself. To him, it was a matter of course for the benefits to be tilted towards him during the process, so that he could obtain more benefits in the process. Arriving in front of the phantasm of the world group, Luo Fan raised his hand and waved it in the air. The phantasm of the world group trembled slightly and naturally dispersed, turning into a cosmic starry sky that scattered in all directions. Along with this change, the expression of the leader in the central camp changed drastically. With a loud bang, his entire body exploded, and an unparalleled power was released from his body, completely shredding the surrounding space. Many of the rogue cultivators not far away from him were devoured by the power, and their bodies directly exploded under the power. This was a formation that could divide the tens of thousands of tributaries into tens of millions of tributaries. It was an extremely intricate and mysterious formation to begin with. For such a formation, once a part of it was damaged, it would be reflected on the formation as a whole. Even if there were all sorts of compensatory and replacement measures that would not cause the entire formation to collapse because of the slightest negligence or damage, the efficiency and strength of the formation would definitely be greatly affected. At this moment, the entire formation that divided the tens of thousands of tributaries into tens of millions of tributaries began to tremble slightly. The restraining force on every tributary began to weaken at this moment. If the creation force was just a stable stream of water, then this change wouldn't have caused too great of a change. At most, the tributaries would just tremble a few times. But obviously, this didn't exist. The creation force was a supreme force that could split the heavens and earth and could completely devour rogue cultivators. The fact that they were restrained in the tributaries was already a change that went against the rules of its operation. At every moment, the creation force was constantly releasing incredible pressure in all directions to crush the formation that enveloped the tributaries. Under such circumstances, the force that was restraining the tributaries suddenly weakened and the creation force was naturally affected. The boundless pressure seemed to have found an outlet and began to crazily pour out. The swaying tributaries constantly condensed and exploded. As they crazily crushed, the tributaries of the river of creation began to surge and distort. It was even to the extent that after a few breaths of time, one of the tributaries emitted an enormous bang that shook the heavens and the earth, and it suddenly exploded into pieces. Endless creation force gushed out from the tributaries at this moment and began to frantically spread across the entire rogue cultivator territory. **T. Cries of alarm came from all directions. Immediately afterward, figures began to quickly flee into the distance, trying their best to stay as far away from the place where the creation force was spreading. "Damn it, what's going on? That trash was so confident before, but now he can't do it anymore?" The ruler of this civilization was shocked and furious at this moment, and an indescribable resentment appeared on his face. However, it was only resentment, and it hadn't reached the level of despair. After all, after this series of changes, even if the other rogue cultivator's plan succeeded, the benefits wouldn't be too great for him. In fact, he might even be reduced to a state that was only slightly better than ordinary rogue cultivators. And once the plan failed, although he would suffer huge losses, he would still be able to survive freely under the numerous creation force with the world cluster. In fact, his cultivation environment would even be much better than before. In this way, this kind of situation that was almost hopeless for an ordinary rogue cultivator was nothing to him. In fact, his resentment at this moment was mostly because the ruler forcefully snatched his plan but didn't have the ability to carry it out, making a mess of the plan. This naturally wasn't enough to make him feel despair. "It's him." At this moment, a voice filled with fear and despair entered his ears. Instinctively, he already knew who this him was. The ruler, who was originally just resentful during the drastic change, finally showed a trace of despair on his face at this moment. He scanned his surroundings with his perception and instantly locked onto a figure that was floating in front of a collapsed world cluster. It was a figure that didn't hide its intentions at all. It was a figure that looked extremely familiar and had even become an unshakable and undefeatable representative in his memory. It was the figure of the great being who had created this river of creation. It was the figure that he believed had some sort of scheme and was using all the rogue cultivators as some sort of chess piece. The initial plan has come to fruition. At this moment, one of the rogue cultivators mumbled with a kind of fervor and despair in his eyes. That rogue cultivator was none other than the researcher who first proposed this plan to the ruler of this civilization. Back then, the researcher had only proposed this plan to confirm if there was some sort of scheme behind the river of creation. As for the benefits that the tributaries of the river of creation would bring to the rogue cultivators, everything else was only secondary. It was just that after many changes, the tributaries eventually became the focus of the many rogue cultivators and rulers. Instead, they unknowingly neglected the original goal. Now, as soon as Luo Fan appeared, he ruined everyone's plan and caused the rivers that they created to distort, change, and collapse. However, this was in line with the initial outcome that the researcher had expected when he first proposed the plan. His words were heard clearly by the rulers and rogue cultivators who were already extremely vigilant. In an instant, the expressions of the rulers who knew what was going on became even grimmer. For such words to appear at this moment was simply a direct accusation of how unnecessary their previous actions were. Meanwhile, the rogue cultivators who originally did not know what the plan was and were only following orders, in other words, the members of the various civilizations, all had bloodshot eyes, and their expressions were filled with extreme hatred. They had always been told how many benefits this plan would bring them and how much smoother their cultivation would be in the future. However, they had never been told that this plan was actually just a test of success and failure. At this moment, they naturally felt like they had been betrayed. In the face of such emotions, the strings of their rationality were almost about to snap at any time, and their expressions of hatred gradually turned ferocious. As the emotions of the rogue cultivators changed, the array formation that was already on the verge of collapse began to shake even more. Originally, this array formation could still last for a long time and even had a chance to repair its damage. However, at this moment, as the rogue cultivator's emotions became unstable, it collapsed to the bottom, and the speed and scale of its collapse began to increase rapidly. Chapter 2233. Whether it was for living beings or physical bodies, or even for heaven, earth, world, or space-time, there were endless benefits to being reborn. There were many kinds of benefits, but the most direct one was to be reborn and break through the congenital shackles, greatly increasing one's potential and giving one the foundation to achieve higher achievements. It was clearly the same for the world group in front of them. From the perspective of the world group, the many rogue cultivators, whether they were ordinary members or those who had established civilizations, become the rulers of civilizations, and opened up their own world group, could actually be considered as experts with congenital deficiencies. From the perspective of the world group, the creation energy was the nourishment for their own growth. It was equivalent to a lot of nutrients that an ordinary person absorbed as he grew up. As a result, no matter how many Genesis energy the rogue cultivators possessed, it was impossible for them to absorb Genesis energy limitlessly and establish their own world group in one go when they were establishing their own world group. They could only rely on waves of creation energy intermittently to make the world group grow bit by bit in a state of hunger. This was equivalent to a baby's mother not being able to provide enough nutrition for it to grow. She would starve it for 3 days at a time. How could the baby not be born with a congenital deficiency? It was precisely because of this that although the world group of the rogue cultivators had been opened up, the world group created by any rogue cultivator, even the strongest one, was much weaker than the world group created by any of the Tao Masters in the domain of the Tao Masters. To make up for this congenital deficiency, the only choice was to be reborn. The benefits corresponded to the difficulty. If rebirth could bring so many benefits, the difficulty would obviously not be easy. For ordinary creatures, if they wanted to be reborn, they would need to cultivate some kind of exquisite cultivation method and use all kinds of resources to break the original balance and structure of their bodies. Then, they would need to go through some kind of extremely mysterious transformation to re-establish the balance and structure. In the end, they would achieve the effect of being reborn. If it was already so difficult for ordinary living beings, to be reborn in a world group was billions of times more difficult than for a living being. How could he succeed so easily? Clearly, the master of this world cluster had borrowed the power of the sublimation of his own world cluster to break the balance and structure of the world cluster, before using the power of creation to re-establish balance and structure, allowing the world cluster to be reborn. If Luo Fan wasn't here, his plan would have a high chance of succeeding. This was not because Luo Fan did not want the world group to be reborn and would definitely stop it. Instead, it was because in the process of rebirth, the old balance and structure would be broken, and the new balance and structure would not be established for the time being. That was when it was at its weakest. At this time, any movement could bring great damage to the world cluster, and the entire process of rebirth would be ruined. Clearly, although Luo Fan had no intention of interrupting the process of rebirth, he had directly brushed away all the appearances of the world cluster and directly observed the mysterious process at the core of the world cluster. This had already disturbed the fragile resistance of the world cluster and directly interrupted the process of rebirth. What a pity! Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh after realizing what was going on. At this moment, the two layers of the huge formation had completely collapsed. At first, it was just a collapsed tributary, but at this time, it was as if its fundamental structure had collapsed, and the collapse began to spread to all the other tributaries. All sorts of earth-shattering sounds rang out in the void. Majestic creation energy was released from the tributaries, and quickly spread to the void, filling up the absolute void that originally had no creation energy. Due to the fact that there wasn't any creation energy in the surroundings, not only did the creation energy not encounter any resistance, but it also seemed to be pushed by the void's thirst for the creation energy. The speed at which the creation energy spread was several times greater than the pressure from the river of creation. From afar, it looked like a large cloud of mist was frantically spreading in all directions, devouring the void in a frenzy. "Hurry up and enter the world cluster," a ruler yelled at this moment. As he said that, the power of his world cluster spread out and enveloped the itinerant cultivators around him as much as possible, helping them withstand the boundless creation energy that was flying towards them from all directions. The roar made the itinerant cultivators and rulers come to a sudden realization. They immediately abandoned the originally collapsed formation and quickly huddled together. They huddled together with the ruler of the world cluster as the center. Fortunately, the itinerant cultivators had mostly huddled together with the civilization as the center. At this time, there was no conflict about who they should rely on, who they could not rely on, or who was under too much pressure, or who was not under too much pressure. No, it was not that all itinerant cultivators did not have such conflict. There was a camp of tens of thousands of itinerant cultivators that had already fallen into chaos. That camp was the itinerant cultivator under the ruler who led the last operation to pluck the peaches. Don't forget, at this moment, that ruler's body had already collapsed due to the backlash of the formation. It was unknown if he had died or something else, but he did not appear in this position. Without that legitimate ruler to rely on, the itinerant cultivators naturally fell into chaos. They could not unify their opinions and were at a loss as to which ruler to rely on, or rather, which ruler would accept them. If things were not so urgent, they could still think calmly or even discuss calmly. This kind of chaos was naturally nothing, and they could quickly find a ruler who was willing to accept them through discussion and probing. But clearly, this was not the time for them to calmly discuss and probe. At this moment, the rulers were all extremely anxious. They were even worried about whether their world might be able to withstand the boundless power of creation. Even if they wanted to include the independent cultivators under their rule in their protection, they were already having a hard time doing so. How could they have the mood to care about the itinerant cultivators who were not their subordinates? Therefore, seeing that the itinerant cultivators were about to be completely drowned by the Genesis energy, an indescribable despair appeared in the eyes of the itinerant cultivators. They instinctively charged in all directions, wanting to sink into the protection circle of a ruler. However, the protection circle was not close to them. After all, even from a macro perspective, the rulers were closely connected to each other. They formed a huge formation and seemed to be extremely close to each other. But that was only from a macro perspective. In reality, the distance between the various camps was at least calculated in light years. Such a distance was enough to become a natural moat in the eyes of the itinerant cultivators at this critical moment. Most of them could not reach the camp of another ruler in time. Even a few lucky itinerant cultivators with faster reflexes and speed could travel a long distance in an extremely short period of time and reach the camp of another ruler. However, they could not enter the camp at all. They were directly intercepted by the power of the world cluster released by the ruler. They were forcefully blocked by the power of the world cluster released by the ruler as the Genesis energy. That was to be expected. After all, the rulers had unleashed the might of such a world swarm to intercept the power of creation that they believed would bring them endless danger and could even devour all of them. Under such circumstances, How could they not activate the defense and isolation power of the world cluster to the extreme? How could the itinerant cultivators who could not withstand the Genesis energy break through the defense that was activated to the extreme? What was so strange about such a performance? No. The itinerant cultivators were completely enveloped by the Genesis energy amidst their cries of agony. In the end, they fell into an endless cycle of life and death. Damn it! At this moment, the power of the world cluster appeared out of nowhere in the Genesis energy. The camp where the leader had disappeared and all the itinerant cultivators were enveloped by the Genesis energy appeared. A cultivator appeared in the void along with the power of the world cluster. From the looks of it, it was the leader whose body had collapsed earlier. Looking at the elite cultivators under him being continuously destroyed by the Genesis energy, the ruler's expression became even more unsightly. "I'm still a step too late," the thought flashed across his mind with a hint of regret in his eyes. Even though he was already here and possessed enough world might to protect the elite rogue cultivators under him, he still couldn't do anything about it. However, he did not dare to do so at this moment. This was because the itinerant cultivators had already been infiltrated by the Genesis energy. They were already in the process of adapting to the Genesis energy. Under such circumstances, if he were to protect them and separate them from the Genesis energy, then not only would he not be able to protect their lives, but he would also end up killing them. This had actually happened many times over the years. In the past, there were cultivators who had made preparations before entering the river of creation so that when the fellow Taoists outside saw that they could not withstand the Genesis energy, they would pull them out of the river of creation. At that time, the itinerant cultivator's performance in the river of creation was extremely tragic. The fellow Taoists outside could not bear to watch, so they followed his instructions and forcefully pulled him out of the river of creation. However, at that moment an incomparably tragic thing happened. The Genesis energy that still existed in the itinerant cultivator's body completely corroded him. All traces of his existence were completely erased, and the itinerant cultivator's body and soul were directly destroyed. From then on, everyone understood that once they entered the Genesis energy and began to endure the test of the Genesis energy, they would start to adapt to the process of the Genesis energy. At that point, there would be no way back, and they could only continue forward. There were many studies as to why this was the case. The most reliable theory was that when a cultivator entered the Genesis energy, their body and mind would establish a strange balance because of the Genesis energy. The power of creation that seeped into a cultivator's body would quickly corrode and destroy the cultivator, while the power of creation outside would continuously repair the corroded and destroyed body and mind, thus forming a complete illusion, forming a miraculous balance. In such a balance, both internal and external powers of creation were indispensable. If any one of them was missing, the cultivator would definitely be doomed. Under such circumstances, pulling the cultivator out of the power of creation was equivalent to taking away the power of creation from the outside. This naturally destroyed the balance, and the cultivator would naturally be completely corroded by the power of creation in the body. In the midst of regret, the ruler's eyes flashed and he looked in a direction that almost all the cultivators did not dare to look at. The direction where the projection of the world cluster was originally located. The direction where Luo Fan was. At this moment, the figure that seemed to envelop the entire world was still hovering there. The endless Genesis energy around him kept surging and attacking, but it did not affect him at all. He stood there quietly with a calm and peaceful expression, as if the extremely tragic scene around him did not exist at all. Looking at the figure, the ruler's body trembled slightly, and a look of horror and panic appeared in his eyes. "Your Excellency, what exactly do you want to do?" Hearing this, Luo Fan shook his head and laughed. "What do I want to do? All of this was caused by you guys. What has it got to do with me? How is it unrelated to you? If you didn't attack my world cluster projection just now, how could this formation collapse, and how could the situation be this bad? The ruler roared. Although he was extremely fearful, because of the tragic scenes around him that stimulated his soul, he was ready to throw caution to the wind. Are you sure you can really succeed? Luo Fan only smiled and raised his hand to point behind the ruler. The ruler was slightly startled. How could he not know what was behind him? Behind him was an incomparably long and huge Genesis River that spanned across the entire territory of the rogue cultivators. How huge was the Genesis River? Just any one of the billions of portals outside was enough for the rogue cultivators to gather and form a civilization. Needless to say, the scale of the civilization was huge. Facing such a huge existence, the tens of millions of tributaries that they had opened up previously were as insignificant as a strand of hair growing on a giant's body. When the time is right, we will naturally seal these tributaries and let the Genesis River close up again. The ruler gritted his teeth and said, "There's no point in lying to ourselves like this." Luo Fan only sighed. He took a step forward, and in the blink of an eye, he had already arrived in front of the rogue cultivator. At this moment, the power of the world cluster around the rogue cultivator finally reacted. It surged with all its might and rapidly crushed towards Luo Fan, trying to stop him from doing anything. However, it was a pity that this method was ultimately too slow. At this moment, Luo Fan had already reached out and placed his hand on the ruler's shoulder. As the hand landed on the ruler's shoulder, the ruler felt a monstrous might wash over him. Whether it was his body, power, world cluster, spirit, or life essence, everything was instantly washed over by the boundless might. As the might washed over him, the ruler felt all his power disappear. Even his connection with the world cluster was completely cut off. Since the world group was isolated, the power of the world group that he possessed naturally disappeared as well. How is this possible? I'm just a clone here. Why did I suddenly turn into my main body? At this moment, the ruler had an extremely shocked expression on his face. One must know that his main body had always been in his own world cluster. The one that left the world cluster and came here was only a clone that was formed under the support of the world cluster's power. Because of this, even though he looked like he was completely torn to pieces, as though he had died and his soul dispersed, he could still recover and reappear here. However, at this moment, he felt that the difference between his clone and his main body had been completely erased. This body that was originally just a clone had suddenly turned into his main body. As for what his main body looked like, since his connection with the world cluster had been completely cut off, he did not know at all. Naturally, he could not confirm what state he was in at this moment. This power is only a 10,000th of the final impact. Luo Fan said calmly. Even so, you're confident that you can withstand the final impact? Hearing this, the ruler's expression froze. He instinctively rejected the possibility that what he said was true. Impossible. According to the trend of the increase in power, the final impact can't reach the level of power you're releasing now. The words spoken under the impulse of fear are meaningless. Luo Fan just smiled and said. As he spoke, he waved his hand and the power that had completely sealed the ruler disappeared. As the power disappeared, the ruler felt that he had re-established a connection with his world cluster. Chapter 2234. To the ruler's senses, the location of his world cluster, and even the entirety of the civilization he controlled, had been engulfed by the power of creation. From the moment his clone left his world cluster until now, he felt that only a few dozen breaths had passed. Normally, no matter how fast the creation energy spread, it would at most be a few light-years away. How could it have spread to his world cluster that was billions of light-years away? At this moment, the only thing he could think of was that the Almighty in front of him had used a technique that he did not understand. It was this method that he did not understand that allowed the boundless power of creation to spread to the location of his world cluster billions of light years away in such a short time. It seems that although you have condensed your own world cluster, your understanding of the power of creation is still limited to the surface. Luo Fan just sighed at this time. In fact, he did not do anything else just now. The reason why the ruler felt that it was unbelievable that the creation energy had spread to such a vast area in just a few dozen breaths, was that to him, only a few dozen breaths had passed. However, to the outside world, to the creation energy itself, and even to the entire independent cultivator domain, several years had passed. The reason for this was very simple. That was because Luo Fan had disrupted the connection between the ruler and the surrounding void at that moment. He had disrupted the ruler's perception of time, which was originally of the same origin, causing him to instinctively search for his own time coordinates from the surrounding power of creation. To the surrounding creation energy, time was merely one of its attributes. In fact, it was merely a variable. In this way, the time coordinates inside the power of creation were completely random. It had no connection with the time in the outside world, in the territory of the rogue cultivators. The ruler determined that only a few dozen breaths had passed by using the time coordinates in the surrounding creation energy. However, in reality, several years had passed in the independent cultivator domain. Aren't you afraid of the Tao Master's prison? The ruler looked at Luo Fan with a horrified look in his eyes, and said through gritted teeth. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "The Tao Master's prison? What I'm doing now doesn't violate any of the basic rules of the Tao Master's path. How could the Tao Master's prison find me? You killed 90% of the practitioners in the individual cultivator area. Is this still in line with the basic rules of the Tao Master's path?" The ruler was obviously very dissatisfied. Luo Fan shook his head and laughed. Since when did you think that the path to becoming a Tao Master would care about your life and death? For the path of Tao Master, you or we are just some insignificant parasites in a certain period of its long history. No matter how many of you I kill, what loss is there to it? On the contrary, if I kill more of them, I might get some unexpected benefits on the road to becoming a Tao Master. It's fine that it didn't reward me, but how could it come to deal with me? His words caused the ruler's face to turn pale. He wanted to stubbornly refute Luo Fan's words, but his rationality told him that what Luo Fan said was true. For the Tao Master's path, the lives of the individual cultivators, and even the disciples of the Tao Master, did not matter. Even if all the individual cultivators were killed, the Tao Master's path would not blame him, let alone the fact that the individual cultivators' lives were unknown. Unless the person in front of him came from a higher level. At this thought, his eyes lit up and he thought of an idea. He immediately sneered and said, "Then let me see if you really have the confidence to do so. Descend, power of the Tao Master's prison." At this moment, the backup plan that he had prepared was suddenly activated. As his backup plan was activated, the power of the Tao Master's prison descended from the sky and landed directly on him. It wrapped around his body and began to sweep in all directions, instantly wrapping around Luo Fan. "I was almost fooled by you. If you were really a cultivator from the 4th level, the Tao Master's prison would naturally not be activated because of what you did. However, you are a cultivator from a higher level who came from a higher level. That is against the rules of the Tao Master's path. As long as the Tao Master's prison discovers your existence, you will never be able to hide. As for your actions of slaughtering so many rogue cultivators, you will definitely be punished later on. Come, let's enter the Tao Master's prison together. Based on my previous mistakes, I will at most be locked up for a few 100 million years. However, you will definitely be thrown into the deepest abyss, or even never to be reincarnated." The ruler laughed. Hearing this, Luo Fan was stunned, then looked at the ruler sympathetically and said, When did I say that I came from a higher level who went against the rules? As he spoke, the power of the Tao Lord's purgatory swept past him, as if his body was nothing more than an illusion, or as if the power of the Tao Lord's purgatory was nothing more than an illusion. At this moment, the ruler sensed a scream coming from the depths of the power of creation, the power of the Tao Master's prison? Who activated the power of the Tao Master's prison? I have already completely restrained myself. As the cries rang out, waves of fluctuations came from all directions. Then, his figure gradually disappeared. He was enveloped by the power of the Tao Master's prison and was thrown into the depths of the Tao Master's prison. How is this possible? If he's so powerful, how can he not be from a higher level? Even a disciple of a Tao Master can't reach this level. Is this really the level that a cultivator from the 4th level can reach? At this moment, he completely disregarded the power of the Tao Master's prison and just muttered with a look of disbelief, then gradually disappeared without a trace. What a pity! If this person was sucked into the Cosmos group, it would definitely cause a storm. Watching the ruler's figure gradually being thrown into the Tao Master's prison, Luo Fan could not help but sigh, a look of regret on his face. For this person to be able to cause such a huge storm in such a short period of time as an independent cultivator, and even persuade tens of millions of other rulers to act with him, of course, this was partly because his ability to sublimate from the Cosmos group was extremely suitable for this operation, but more importantly, his leadership and leadership ability had reached a shocking level. With such leadership and leadership ability, he would definitely be able to stand out in a Cosmos group. In the end, he might even be able to trigger a large-scale war in the entire Cosmos group, causing many Cosmos group to undergo drastic changes. For Luo Fan, the changes in the Cosmos group were his cultivation method in the 4th level. The greater the change, the greater the possibility of his cultivation progress in the 4th level. Therefore, how could he not feel that it was a pity that the ruler was thrown into the Tao Master's prison? The ruler did not care about the consequences of activating the power of the Tao Master's prison and how many independent cultivators were thrown into the Tao Master's prison. But Luo Fan was completely different from him. To Luo Fan, these countless independent cultivators represented an endless supply of resources. If an independent cultivator was thrown into the Tao Master's prison, it meant that he lacked the cultivation resources that the independent cultivator could bring him. Therefore, how could he not care about these independent cultivators? At this moment, he swept his gaze across and saw all the independent cultivators who were trapped in the Tao Master's prison. Most of the independent cultivators were rulers of their respective civilizations. The fact that these rulers could stand out among the many independent cultivators meant that they had done much more than the other independent cultivators. The more they did, the more likely they were to violate the rules of the Tao Master's path, and the greater the commotion they caused after being discovered by the Tao Master's prison. Although it's a pity, it still saves me a lot of trouble. Seeing the rulers disappear under the power of the Tao Master's prison, Luo Fan felt a sense of regret mixed with a trace of satisfaction. It was a pity that the rulers were thrown into the prison, causing him to lose the cultivation resources that they could have brought him. On the other hand, he was satisfied that their departure would cause their world group to dissipate. This also meant that the independent cultivators who were originally attached to their world group could only face the creation energy head-on. They could be directly pulled into the Tao Master's domain, where they could create their own world group and connect with his world group. Their main bodies would be pulled into the world group and help his world group evolve, just like the independent cultivators under the Tao Master's tutelage. At this moment, as the rulers were pulled into the Tao Master's prison, their world group began to destabilize. The heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time gradually dispersed, before being devoured by the surrounding creation energy and turned into creation energy again. The independent cultivators who relied on the world group's defenses to survive in the boundless creation energy were all horrified. All sorts of expressions of fear, anger, bewilderment, despair, or desperation appeared on their faces. In the end, they were all pulled into the creation energy with all sorts of complicated emotions, and began the endless cycle of life and death that ordinary cultivators experienced. After several years of development, the entire river of creation had completely collapsed. The endless creation energy that existed within it had already broken free from the restrictions of the river of creation and spread across the entire independent cultivator domain, filling every inch of the independent cultivator domain with the boundless creation energy. However, the further one was from the source of the river of creation, which was the fist-sized hole that connected to the Tao Master's domain, the lower the concentration of creation energy. Of course, this was only relatively speaking. Even the lowest concentration of the Genesis energy was still many times stronger than the concentration that an ordinary independent cultivator could easily resist. The reason why it had developed to this stage in the past few years was very simple. It was because Luo Fan had not maintained the formation that maintained the stability of the river of creation all these years. After all, the river of creation was a long river filled with endless creation energy. The pressure from the power of creation had reached an unimaginable level. Even just a little bit of that pressure was enough to make any independent cultivator on the fourth level exhaust all their means to resist it. Moreover, the river of creation was endless, so it was easy to imagine how difficult it would be to resist it. Even if this formation had fused with all of Luo Fan's comprehensions of the world group and all of his cultivation achievements, it was still an extremely difficult task to completely withstand it with just a formation. The reason why the formation had been able to stabilize and allow the river of creation to exist was because Luo Fan was guarding the source of the river of creation, because he was instinctively adjusting the formation at all times, and also adjusting the river of creation. Otherwise, what was the point of him projecting a clone at the source of the river of creation? Was it just to capture the independent cultivators that sank into the river of creation? Previously, after the independent cultivators destroyed the formation, he had already made a decision to give up on maintaining the formation and adjusting the river of creation. He allowed the independent cultivator domain and the Tao Master's domain to interact with each other through the fist-sized hole. As a result, the formation that restricted the river of creation collapsed at an unimaginable speed through the hole created by the rulers. In just a few days, the formation on the surface of the river of creation had completely collapsed, causing the endless creation power within the river of creation to leak out in all directions without any restrictions. After that, it took a few more years for the boundless space within the rogue cultivator's territory to be filled with the power of creation. There was no need to mention how desperate, regretful, angry, cursed, and begged the independent cultivators during this process. Only the final result made Luo Fan slightly satisfied. The channel has widened? Suddenly, Luo Fan furrowed his brows and narrowed his eyes. There seemed to be two rays of light that pierced through the barrier of the endless creation power and saw the original source of the river of creation, the channel that connected the independent cultivator domain and the Tao Master's domain. Compared to before, that passageway was a little bigger. This change surprised Luo Fan. With a thought, his figure instantly tore through the barrier of the endless creation power and came to the side of the channel. When he came here, he carefully sensed and found that as the endless creation power continuously surged out of the channel, the edge of the channel was being worn away at an extremely slow speed. Faintly, he was even able to see countless complicated and indescribable talisman markings, lines, words, and even various lights and shadows that couldn't be described with words. All of this, under the scouring of the creation power, turned into bits of debris that constantly broke away, integrated into the creation power, and disappeared without a trace. It can be worn away? Looking at this scene, Luo Fan lost his original composure. Faintly, there seemed to be light shining from his eyes. The reason why this channel existed was actually because he had used various methods to fuse the channel between the Tao Master's domain and the Rogue Cultivator's domain. As for why the countless small channels that originally existed could only allow wisps of creation power to seep in, but now that they were fused together, they could support the huge and long river of creation. The reason was naturally even simpler. It was nothing more than an environment that Luo Fan's main body had created in the Tao Master's domain, an environment that was thousands of times denser than an ordinary environment. In other words, it seemed that Luo Fan had easily broken the barrier between the two domains. But in fact, he couldn't do anything about the barrier at all. It was precisely because of this that he was so shocked when he found that the barrier was actually melting under the scouring of the creation power. At this moment, he completely forgot about the many rogue cultivators in the Rogue Cultivator's domain and focused on the channel, on the way the creation power worked on the barrier. For existences at their level, there was absolutely no change in the universe that couldn't be reproduced. There was no pattern that couldn't be summarized. What happened in the channel in front of him, the erosion of the creation power on the barrier, was at most a surprise, an accident, or even a miracle in the eyes of ordinary living beings. It was impossible to study and summarize it at all. However, in Luo Fan's eyes, it was a key to understand the barrier. At this moment, he activated his perception. His boundless perception wrapped around the surroundings of the passageway, delving into every point of contact between the edges of the passageway and the power of creation. He absorbed the reaction between the power of creation and every point into his heart. The creation power was a power that the four basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy condensed together in an extremely strange way and transformed into a form of power. This power naturally didn't have any basic units, nor did it have anything like the so-called creation power particles. No matter how deep he went, no matter how many times he magnified his vision, the creation power was still the creation power, and it looked no different from a macroscopic view. Obviously, although the barrier was more stable than the creation power, it ultimately didn't have the characteristics of the creation power. As Luo Fan's vision went deeper, the appearance of the barrier changed. In the beginning, it was just a faintly discernible layer of thin film. As he went deeper, it turned into countless runes, lines, words, patterns, and even strange lights and shadows. As he went deeper, it turned into the illusory images of many worlds, the illusory images of many parts of heaven and earth.